Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've been a paramedic in rural Ohio for about 8 years now, and nothing really prepares you for what I experienced last Thursday night. I was pulling a double shift with my partner, Jake, because we were short-staffed again, typical for our small county station. Around 11 p.m., we got dispatched to a single vehicle accident on Highway 47, right by mile marker 23. That stretch of road is notorious for accidents because of the sharp curve that comes out of nowhere after a long straight section. We'd responded to plenty of crashes there before, but something about this particular night felt different from the moment we got the call. The dispatcher's voice had this strange hesitation when she gave us the victim's name, Catherine Brennan, 32 years old. I remember thinking it was odd how she repeated the name twice, real slow, like she was making sure we heard it right. When we arrived at the scene, the car was completely wrapped around a telephone pole, the front end crushed like an aluminum can. The driver's side was caved in so badly that I honestly didn't expect to find anyone alive in there. But there she was, Catherine Brennan, conscious and talking, asking about her purse of all things. She had this deep gash across her forehead that was bleeding pretty bad, and her left arm was clearly broken, bent at an angle that made Jake wince. But considering the state of that Toyota Camry, she should have been dead on impact. I've seen enough crashes to know when physics doesn't add up, and this was one of those times. While Jake worked on stabilizing her neck, I noticed she kept mumbling something about being late for dinner, about how her husband would be worried. Her eyes had this distant quality, like she was looking through me rather than at me. But her vitals were surprisingly stable. Blood pressure a little low, but nothing critical. Steady pulse, responsive pupils. We got her out of the wreck using the jaws of life. Took us about 20 minutes of careful cutting to extract her without causing more damage. The whole time, Catherine kept apologizing, saying she didn't mean to cause trouble, that she just needed to get home. There was something mechanical about the way she spoke, like she was reciting lines she'd memorized. Her skin felt oddly cool to the touch, even though it was a warm September night, and when I checked her pupils again with my pen light, they reacted normally but seemed to have this grayish tint around the edges. Jake mentioned later that he noticed it too, said it reminded him of cataracts, but Catherine was way too young for that. We loaded her into the ambulance and I rode in the back with her while Jake drove. During the 15-minute ride to County General, she asked me 3 times what day it was, and each time I told her it was Thursday, she'd nod slowly and say, "Thursday, right, Thursday." At the hospital, Dr. Nguyen took over immediately, whisking Catherine away for x-rays and a CT scan. Jake and I grabbed coffee in the break room, filling out our paperwork and talking about how lucky she'd been. The charge nurse, Donna, overheard us discussing the case and got this weird look on her face. She asked us to repeat the patient's name, and when we said Catherine Brennan, she literally dropped her clipboard. Donna's been working emergency for 20 years. Nothing rattles her, but she went pale as a sheet. She pulled us into an empty exam room and closed the door behind her. "That's not possible," she kept saying, shaking her head. Then she told us that Catherine Brennan had been brought in DOA 5 days ago, Monday night, from a single vehicle accident on Highway 47, same exact location, mile marker 23. She'd hit the same telephone pole. Donna even pulled up the records on her tablet to show us. Same name, same age, same address, even the same Toyota Camry. Silver, license plate ending in 347. Jake thought Donna was messing with us at first, but her face told a different story. She showed us the death certificate, the autopsy report. Catherine Brennan had died from massive internal bleeding and head trauma, pronounced dead at 11:47 p.m. that Monday. The attending physician's signature was right there in black ink. I felt this cold weight settle in my chest as I looked at that paperwork, then back at Donna. We'd just brought in a woman who'd been dead for 5 days, and she'd been talking to us, breathing on her own, bleeding real blood. Jake ran back to check with admitting, thinking maybe there'd been some kind of mix-up with the names or paperwork. But the woman we'd brought in had given the same social security number, the same date of birth, even had the same small tattoo on her right wrist, a little hummingbird that Catherine had mentioned her daughter drew for her. The worst part was when Jake pulled up our ambulance's dash cam footage on his phone to prove we weren't losing our minds, and there she was, clear as day, being loaded onto our stretcher. Dr. Nguyen found us about an hour later, looking confused and frustrated. He said Catherine, or whoever we'd brought in, had vanished from radiology. One moment she was on the table waiting for her CT scan. The tech had stepped out to adjust the settings, and when he came back, the room was empty. Security footage showed her walking down the hallway in her hospital gown, moving with this purposeful stride despite her injuries, heading straight for the exit. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. She didn't show up on half the cameras. The ones by the emergency entrance captured her clear as day, but the hallway cameras near radiology just showed an empty corridor with the automatic doors opening and closing by themselves. The security guard, Tom, said he saw her walk right past his desk, even nodded at her. But his partner sitting right next to him swears nobody walked by. They actually got into an argument about it, each one thinking the other was playing some kind of prank. By the time anyone thought to follow her, she was gone, and her hospital gown was found neatly folded in the parking lot, right next to where we'd brought her in. The next morning, around 6 a.m., we got another call. Same location, Highway 47, mile marker 23. My heart started racing when dispatch said the name, Catherine Brennan. Jake and I looked at each other, and without saying a word, we both knew we had to go. When we arrived, there was no accident, no car, nothing but empty road and that same telephone pole with fresh scars from impacts old and new. We sat there in the ambulance for a few minutes, engine running, just staring at that curve in the road. Then dispatch called again. They'd made a mistake, no accident had been reported. But I know what I heard, and Jake heard it too. We drove back to the station in silence, neither of us wanting to talk about what was happening. The shift supervisor, Captain Roberts, was waiting for us when we got back. He'd gotten a call from County General about the incident the night before, and wanted to know if we'd been drinking on duty. When we showed him our dashcam footage, his expression changed from skeptical to concerned. He made us take drug tests right then and there. Both came back clean, obviously. That afternoon, I couldn't sleep even though I was exhausted, so I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove to the address listed in Catherine Brennan's file, a small ranch house on Sycamore Drive, about 10 miles from the accident site. A man answered the door, mid-30s, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When I introduced myself and mentioned Catherine's name, he just stared at me for the longest time. Then he invited me in, and what he told me made everything infinitely worse. His name was Brian Brennan, Catherine's husband. She died on Monday, just like the hospital records showed. But here's the thing. She'd been driving home from her sister's house in Columbus, a trip she made every Sunday night. She'd called him around 10:30 p.m. saying she was tired and going to pull over at the rest stop for a quick nap. The last thing she told him was that she'd be home soon, that she just needed to close her eyes for a minute. They found her car wrapped around that pole an hour later. But Brian said something that made my skin prickle. Since Monday, he'd been getting voicemails from Catherine's phone every night around 11:30 p.m. Just breathing, sometimes a whisper that sounded like almost home. Then the line would go dead. Her phone was supposedly destroyed in the crash. Brian showed me Catherine's obituary in the local paper, her funeral program from Wednesday, even photos from the service. There she was, same woman we'd pulled from that wreck, lying in a casket surrounded by white roses. He broke down crying, saying he thought he was going crazy, that grief was making him imagine things. I didn't tell him about what happened the night before. How could I? How do you tell someone that you pulled their dead wife from a car crash 3 days after her funeral? But then he grabbed my arm as I was leaving and said something that stopped me cold. He said Catherine had been having the same recurring nightmare for weeks before she died. always about getting into an accident at that exact spot on Highway 47, always trying to get home but never quite making it. She'd even started taking a different route to avoid that stretch of road. But that night, her usual route through downtown was closed for construction. She had no choice but to take Highway 47. Brian asked me if I believed in loops, in people getting stuck somehow. I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed his shoulder and left. When I got back to the station that evening for my next shift, there were 3 more calls logged for that same location throughout the day, all reporting accidents involving Catherine Brennan. But when units arrived, nothing. The other crews were starting to talk, word spreading through the department about the woman who wouldn't stay dead. Jake had done his own digging and found something that made my stomach turn. Over the past 18 months, there had been 7 fatal accidents at that exact spot. All single vehicles, all late at night, all drivers who were traveling alone. But Catherine's name only started appearing after her death on Monday. The county commissioner had approved funds for better lighting and warning signs for that curve 6 months ago, but the work kept getting delayed. Contractor issues, supply problems, always something. Jake pulled up the work orders, and every single delay was logged on a Monday night, right around 11:30 p.m. The contractor's notes mentioned equipment mysteriously moving overnight, fresh tire marks appearing that didn't match any of their vehicles, and workers reporting they felt uncomfortable at the site, though nobody could explain exactly why. That night, Thursday again, we got the call at exactly 11:00 p.m. Same location, same name, but this time dispatch sounded different. Tired, mechanical, like they were reading from a script. Jake wanted to ignore it, said we should let another unit take it, but we both knew nobody else would go. When we arrived, the scene was exactly as it had been the night before. The silver Camry wrapped around the pole, the door caved in, everything identical down to the pattern of broken glass on the asphalt. But this time, when I approached the vehicle, Catherine was looking right at me through the shattered windshield. Not through me like before, but at me. And she said my name. She knew my name. She thanked me for trying to help her, said she was sorry for the trouble, but she needed to get home. Her husband was waiting. Her injuries were exactly the same. The gash on her forehead, the broken arm, everything precisely as it had been 24 hours earlier. We went through the entire routine again. Extraction, stabilization, transport. But this time, I noticed something different. The blood on her forehead wasn't flowing right. It would drip, then seem to reverse, like a video playing backward for just a second. Jake saw it too, went completely quiet, just focused on driving faster. At the hospital, I made a decision. Instead of taking her through the normal admission process, I stayed with her, never let her out of my sight. I held her hand while they wheeled her to radiology, stood right outside the door during the CT scan. She kept asking what day it was, and when I said Thursday, she'd get this confused look and whisper, "But I already lived through Thursday." Around midnight, she became agitated, said she needed to leave, that if she didn't go now, she'd miss her chance. I tried to calm her down, but she grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked me dead in the eyes. "Every night," she said, "I take that curve, and every night I don't make it home. But maybe if someone remembers, maybe if someone knows I'm trying." Then she was gone. Not vanished like before. She just closed her eyes and flatlined. Dr. Nguyen called it at 12:03 a.m., and this time she stayed dead. The body remained cold and still, and when they checked her liver temperature, she'd been dead for days, just like the original autopsy showed. The calls stopped after that night. No more Catherine Brennan. No more phantom accidents at mile marker 23. The county finally installed those lights and warning signs the following week. The contractor said it was the smoothest job they'd ever done, like something that had been blocking them was suddenly gone. I went to see Brian one more time, told him Catherine had been trying to come home, that she wanted him to know that. He cried, but it seemed like a weight had lifted from his shoulders. He said the phone calls had stopped too, right at 12:03 a.m. that Friday morning. His phone had rung one last time, and when he answered, he heard Catherine's voice clear as day saying, "I made it." Then nothing but dial tone. He played me the voicemail. It was just static to my ears, but he swore he could hear her. Maybe he could. I've learned not to question what people experience in their grief. Jake and I never talked about it directly again, but we both put in requests to change our Thursday night shifts. Captain Roberts approved them without asking questions. I think he knew something had happened that didn't fit in any report. The official paperwork showed that we responded to one fatal accident on Monday night, Catherine Brennan, DOA. Everything else, the Thursday night calls, the second crash, her disappearing from the hospital, none of it exists in any official record. The other crews who logged those phantom calls during the week all amended their reports to equipment malfunction. Sometimes that's easier than trying to explain the unexplainable. I still drive past that spot sometimes, and they've had no accidents there since the lights went up. But every Thursday night around 11 p.m., I notice fresh tire marks on the shoulder right by that pole, like someone pulled over and stopped for a moment before continuing home. I like to think it's Catherine, finally making that turn, finally completing her journey, even if it's somewhere we can't see. I spent 12 years as a paramedic in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and thought I'd seen everything the job could throw at me. February of 2022 changed that perspective completely. I was working the night shift with my partner Gary, a 20-year veteran who trained me when I first started. We'd been partnered for about 6 years at that point, and between us we'd handled thousands of calls, overdoses, car accidents, heart attacks, you name it. Our station covered the east side of the city, mostly residential neighborhoods mixed with some industrial areas near the river. It was a Tuesday night, cold as hell with that kind of wind that cuts right through your uniform no matter how many layers you've got on. We'd just finished dinner at the station, some leftover chili Gary's wife had sent with him, when the first call came through around 11:47 p.m. The dispatch came in as a code 3, lights and sirens for a cardiac arrest at 1847 Willow Avenue. Gary grabbed the keys while I pulled up the address on our GPS, but something weird happened. The system couldn't find it. Not unusual in itself. Sometimes new developments don't update right away, or dispatch gets a number wrong. But then our CAD system, the computer that feeds us call information, displayed the address with a red flag next to it. That flag meant the address was marked as non-existent in city records. I mentioned it to Gary, but he just shrugged and said dispatch probably screwed up the street name. We headed toward Willow Avenue anyway, figuring we'd get clarification en route. The whole drive there, dispatch kept updating us with details. Elderly male, approximately 70 years old, wife performing CPR, patient last seen conscious 15 minutes ago. Standard stuff, except when we turned onto Willow Avenue, the numbers jumped from 1845 to 1851. There was no 1847. We parked between the two houses and got out, looking for any sign of distress. The lot where 1847 should have been was just an empty space, overgrown with dead winter grass and surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. No foundation, no driveway, nothing to indicate a house had been there recently. Gary radioed dispatch while I walked the perimeter with my flashlight. The neighboring houses were dark except for porch lights, no signs of anyone doing CPR or having a medical emergency. Dispatch insisted the call was valid. They had a woman on the line saying her husband Harold was turning blue, giving the address as 1847 Willow Avenue. They even played us a snippet of the audio through our radio. The woman's voice was strained, desperate, counting out compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Please hurry, he's not responding. But we were standing in front of an empty lot, and the temperature readout on our ambulance showed 18 degrees. Nobody was outside, no house existed at that address. Gary knocked on the door at 1845, waking up a young couple with a baby. They said the lot next door had been empty since they'd moved in 3 years ago. The husband mentioned something about a fire way before their time, maybe 7 or 8 years back. but he didn't know details. "We checked 1851 on the other side," an elderly woman answered, clearly confused why paramedics were at her door near midnight. She'd lived there since 1987 and told us the house at 1847 had burned down in January of 2015. "Complete loss," she said. The family that lived there, the Bowers, Harold and Margaret Bauer, had both died in the fire. She remembered because she'd gone to both funerals, even showed us the memorial cards she kept in her kitchen drawer. Harold Bauer, age 71. Margaret Bauer, age 68, died January 15, 2015. We thanked her and walked back to our rig, but dispatch was going crazy on the radio, saying the caller was screaming that her husband had stopped breathing. Gary and I sat in the ambulance for a minute, neither of us sure what to do. Dispatch patched the audio through to us directly, and I heard it clear as day. A woman sobbing, begging us to help Harold, saying we must have the wrong house. They were at 1847 Willow Avenue, the white colonial with green shutters. She described the house in detail: the wraparound porch, the 2 dogwood trees in the front yard, the black mailbox with painted cardinals on it. Gary pulled out his phone and searched for news articles about the fire. Found it pretty quick. The Cedar Rapids Gazette, January 16, 2015. Elderly couple perishes in overnight house fire. The article had a photo of the house from before the fire. White colonial, green shutters, 2 dogwood trees in front. The mailbox was hard to see in the picture, but when Gary zoomed in, you could just make out what looked like red birds painted on the side. Every detail the caller was giving dispatch matched a house that had been gone for 7 years. We drove back to the station in silence. Gary wrote up the report as unable to locate patient, and we figured that would be the end of it. Maybe someone was pranking dispatch with spoofed numbers or something. But the next night, Wednesday, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same call came in. Different emergency this time, stroke symptoms, same address, 1847 Willow Avenue. Same caller, Margaret Bauer, saying Harold was slurring his words, his face drooping on the left side. This time we weren't the only unit that responded. Engine 19 showed up too, and their captain, Phil Kowalczyk, was just as confused as we were. He'd actually fought the fire back in 2015, remembered it clearly because it was one of the worst residential fires he'd worked. Said they'd found the couple in their bedroom, looked like they'd been overcome by smoke in their sleep. Now here we all were, standing in front of that same empty lot, while dispatch relayed Margaret's voice describing Harold's symptoms in medical detail that was disturbingly accurate. Facial asymmetry, left arm weakness, difficulty swallowing, onset approximately 20 minutes ago. Phil called his chief directly while we were still on scene. Within an hour, we had IT specialists at dispatch trying to trace the calls. The number coming through showed as disconnected when they tried calling it back. But when the calls came in, they registered as genuine 911 calls from a landline. The phone company confirmed that the number had belonged to the Bauer residence, but was discontinued after the fire in 2015. No one could explain how a deadline was generating active emergency calls. The IT guys stayed at dispatch all night, and sure enough, when we rolled around to the next night, same thing. 11:47 p.m., another call from 1847 Willow Avenue. This time it was difficulty breathing. Harold having an acute asthma attack, according to Margaret. She was using medical terminology, describing respiratory distress, asking if we had albuterol in the rig, saying his oxygen saturation was dropping based on the fingertip pulse oximeter they kept in their bedroom. The details were so specific, so accurate to real emergency protocols, that our medical director, Dr. Anita Freeman, got involved. Dr. Freeman was a no-nonsense trauma surgeon who'd been medical director for our EMS system for 15 years. She pulled all the recordings and had us write detailed statements about each response. Then she did something none of us expected. She had the IT department pull the original 911 recordings from January 15, 2015, the night of the fire. Those calls had been archived in the old system, but they managed to recover them. We all gathered in the conference room at the main station to listen. The first call at 11:47 p.m. was Margaret Bauer reporting that Harold was having chest pains. The second call, about 15 minutes later, was her saying he'd collapsed. She was doing CPR. The third call never got through completely. You could hear coughing, Margaret's voice getting weaker, saying something about smoke, then nothing. The fire department got dispatched on a separate alarm from a neighbor who saw flames, but by then it was too late. Here's what made everyone in that room go quiet. The calls we were getting now in 2022 were almost word for word identical to the first two calls from that night in 2015, except they kept repeating, night after night, different medical emergencies, but always starting at 11:47 p.m. The city administrator got involved after the local news caught wind of it. They brought in consultants, tech experts from the state, even had the FBI's cyber crimes unit take a look in case someone was hacking the 911 system. Nothing. The calls weren't coming from any traceable source. They seemed to originate from nowhere, appearing directly in the dispatch system with all the characteristics of a real emergency call, but no physical origin point. We kept responding every night because we had to. It was protocol. Even knowing no one would be there, even knowing Harold and Margaret Bauer had been dead for 7 years, we had to treat each call as genuine. Some nights it was chest pains, others it was diabetic emergencies, seizures, falls with hip fractures. The medical emergencies varied, but Margaret's voice was always the same. Frightened but trying to stay calm, using their home address, describing Harold's symptoms with the kind of detail that only someone living through it could provide. She'd mention the medications he was on, his medical history, allergies to penicillin and morphine, everything dispatch would need to know. By the end of the second week, it was taking a toll on everyone. Gary started calling in sick for night shifts. Other crews were refusing to respond to that address. The dispatcher who usually worked nights, Janet, requested a transfer to days because she couldn't handle hearing Margaret's voice anymore, especially knowing what we all knew. Phil from Engine 19 dug deeper into the fire investigation records. The official cause was electrical. Old wiring in the walls, probably sparked inside the bedroom wall while they slept. The smoke detectors had batteries, but they were expired, didn't go off in time. The fire spread through the walls and ceiling before breaking through. By then, the smoke had already filled their bedroom. The medical examiner's report showed they'd both died from smoke inhalation, probably never woke up. But here's the detail that got to me. Harold had been having chest pains earlier that evening, according to their neighbor. Margaret had wanted to call 911, but Harold insisted he was fine, just heartburn from dinner. They went to bed at their normal time, around 11:30 p.m. If she'd made that call when she wanted to, they would have been at the hospital when the fire started. The calls continued for exactly 30 days. Each night at 11:47 p.m., Margaret's voice would come through dispatch, reporting a different medical emergency for Harold. We documented every single one: cardiac events, strokes, diabetic comas, severe allergic reactions, breathing difficulties, seizures. 30 different emergency scenarios, all medically accurate, all described with the kind of intimate knowledge a wife of 43 years would have about her husband's health. The 30th night was different, though. It was a Monday in March, and I was actually off duty, but I drove to the empty lot anyway. I'd been doing that even on my nights off, just sitting in my car, watching. Gary was there too in his pickup truck, even though he'd officially transferred to day shift. Phil was there with 2 other firefighters. Janet, the dispatcher who'd transferred, she was there. We all just gathered without planning it, drawn to that empty lot. At 11:47 p.m., our radios crackled. We were all monitoring dispatch from our vehicles. But this time, the call was different. Margaret wasn't reporting a medical emergency. She was calling about smoke in the house. Harold wasn't responding. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. It was the third call from 2015, the one that had cut off. We heard her coughing, gasping, then her voice, weak but clear. We should have gone to the hospital. Tell them we should have gone. Then nothing. Dead air. After that night, the calls stopped completely. The IT department monitored the system 24/7 for weeks, but nothing came through from that address again. The city eventually had the lot cleaned up, put a small memorial plaque there for the Bowers. I still work as a paramedic, but I moved to day shift permanently. Can't do nights anymore. Gary took early retirement last year. We don't talk about it much, but when we do grab a beer occasionally, we both admit the same thing. We still check our phones at 11:47 p.m. sometimes, expecting to hear dispatch tones. The official investigation concluded with no explanation, just noted as a technical anomaly in the system. But those of us who heard Margaret's voice night after night, who responded to that empty lot, we know it wasn't just a glitch. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, never have. But I do believe that sometimes, somehow, echoes of things that should have happened can bleed through. Margaret wanted to call 911 that night for Harold's chest pains. She wanted to, but didn't. Maybe for 30 nights in 2022, she finally got to make those calls she'd wanted to make. That's the only explanation I can live with. I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind. For the past 6 months, I've been a paramedic in Denver, and something's been happening during my shifts that nobody wants to talk about. I'm 32, been in emergency medicine for 8 years now, started as an EMT in California, before moving here for a fresh start after my divorce. The job's always been tough. You see people on their worst days, sometimes their last days. But I've handled it well, never had issues with the stress or the long hours. My supervisor, a gruff guy named Douglas with 20 years under his belt, even said I had the steadiest nerves he'd seen in a rookie at this station. But lately, I've been questioning everything I thought I knew about death, about when someone's really gone, and why these things only happen when I'm the one responding. The first time was in early March, around 3 in the morning. We got called to an apartment complex on the west side. Elderly man named Arthur Simmons, 78 years old, cardiac arrest. His neighbor heard him collapse through the thin walls and called 911. When my partner Vanessa and I arrived, Arthur had been down for at least 15 minutes according to dispatch. No pulse, no breathing, pupils fixed and dilated, textbook signs of death. We worked on him for 30 minutes, pushed 3 rounds of epi, nothing. The ER doctor, a young resident named Dr. Patel who always looked exhausted, called it at 3:47 a.m. Standard procedure, we started cleaning up our equipment while the nurses prepared the body for the morgue. But as I was packing the defibrillator, I saw Arthur's chest rise. Not a gasp or a sudden movement, just a slow, deliberate breath like someone sleeping peacefully. I grabbed Dr. Patel's arm so hard she almost dropped her tablet, pointed at Arthur. But by then his chest was still again. Dr. Patel checked him again, pressed her stethoscope against his chest for a full minute while I held my breath. Nothing. She gave me that look. You know, the one medical professionals give each other when someone's been working too many doubles. Agonal breathing, she said, though Arthur had been declared dead for 5 minutes already. Sometimes the body does things after death. Muscle memory? Residual electrical activity? It happens. Vanessa hadn't seen anything. She'd been facing away, filling out paperwork. I wanted to argue, to insist she run another EKG, but Arthur was already being wheeled away, and we had another call coming in. For the next week, I kept thinking about that single breath, wondering if I'd imagined it. I even pulled Arthur's file later. Confirmed dead on arrival at the morgue. No unusual findings. But that wasn't the last time. 2 weeks later, same thing. Different patient, a woman named Gloria Nash, 53, found unconscious in her bathroom after what looked like a massive stroke. We couldn't get her back, worked on her for 40 minutes before calling it. This time I watched carefully, didn't take my eyes off her after Dr. Reeves, different doctor, same exhausted look, pronounced her at 11:23 p.m. 17 minutes later, While we were still completing paperwork in the hallway, I saw it through the doorway. Gloria's fingers on her left hand curled slowly, deliberately, like she was trying to grasp something. Not a spasm or a twitch, but a controlled movement that lasted maybe 3 seconds. I called Vanessa over immediately, but when we got to the bedside, Gloria's hand was perfectly still, already showing the early signs of rigor mortis setting in. Vanessa thought I was seeing things, suggested I take a few days off, maybe get my eyes checked. I started keeping a journal, documenting every cardiac arrest, every patient we couldn't save. Most were normal, if you can call death normal. But then came patient number 3, April 2nd, a construction worker named Frank Russo who fell from scaffolding. Massive head trauma, never had a chance. We pronounced him on scene at 2:15 p.m., bright sunny day, witnesses everywhere. While we waited for the coroner, I stayed with the body, told everyone I was doing paperwork. For 23 minutes, nothing. Then Frank's chest began rising and falling in a rhythm, steady as clockwork, about 8 breaths per minute. I counted them, filmed it on my phone for 12 seconds before my supervisor called me away for another emergency. When I checked the video later that night in my apartment, all I had was footage of a still body. The timestamp was right, the angle was right, but Frank wasn't breathing in the video. I watched it 40 times, compared it to what I remembered seeing, and started wondering if I was having some kind of breakdown. The thing is, I felt completely fine otherwise. My performance reviews were excellent, I was sleeping well, eating normally, even started dating someone new. A teacher named Melissa who had nothing to do with medical work. But these incidents kept happening, and only during my shifts. I compared notes with other paramedics without directly asking. Nobody else mentioned anything unusual. I even switched partners for a week, worked with an old-timer named Carlos, who'd been doing this for 15 years. The very first cardiac arrest we responded to together, an elderly woman named Dorothy Huang, showed the same signs. After she was pronounced dead at 9:45 p.m., I watched her eyelids flutter rhythmically for 6 minutes straight, like REM sleep. Carlos was standing right next to me, checking his phone. Saw nothing. When I asked if he noticed anything strange, he just shrugged and said the lighting in the hospital made everyone look weird. By May, I'd documented 14 cases, all different causes of death, heart attacks, strokes, trauma, overdoses, but the same post-mortem movements occurring anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes after being pronounced. I tried everything to prove I wasn't imagining it. Bought a body camera with my own money, wore it during shifts claiming it was for training purposes, reviewed hours of footage, found nothing. The movements happened right in front of the camera, I saw them with my own eyes, but the recording showed only stillness. I even tried having Melissa meet me after a particularly difficult shift, where I'd seen a young man named Christopher Vance, motorcycle accident victim, breathing for 40 minutes after death. She held me while I explained everything, suggested maybe I was experiencing some kind of stress response, seeing what I wanted to see, signs of life where there were none. But why would I want to see that? Why would my mind create hope where there was definitively none? The breaking point came 3 nights ago, Saturday. We responded to a home where a 40-year-old woman named Diane Fowler had suffered a massive pulmonary embolism. Her teenage daughter had found her collapsed in the kitchen, called 911 while sobbing so hard, the dispatcher could barely understand her. We worked on Diane for an hour, longer than protocol suggested, because her daughter was watching from the doorway and I couldn't bear to stop. When we finally called it at 11:58 p.m., the daughter broke down completely. While Vanessa comforted her in the living room, I stayed with Diane's body waiting for the coroner. This time I was ready. I set up my phone, my body camera, even borrowed a GoPro from a friend and positioned it on the counter. At 12:19 a.m., Diane's eyes opened. Not fluttered, not twitched. Opened completely, staring directly at me. Her mouth moved like she was trying to speak, and her right hand lifted 3 inches off the gurney before settling back down. I was looking right at her, all 3 cameras running, my pulse racing so hard I thought I might need medical attention myself. When I checked the footage yesterday morning, all 3 cameras showed the same thing. Diane's body, perfectly still, gradually changing color as circulation ceased. The timestamps matched, the angles were different but complementary, and there was absolutely no movement, not even a shadow out of place. I sat in my kitchen replaying the videos over and over, comparing them to my memory, which remained crystal clear. Diane had looked at me, really looked at me, with awareness in her eyes that I've seen in hundreds of living patients. I called in sick for my next shift. Couldn't trust myself to work when I was either hallucinating or experiencing something that defied every medical principle I knew. Vanessa texted asking if I was okay, said Douglas was worried about me. Melissa came over with soup, found me surrounded by medical journals about post-mortem reflexes, Lazarus syndrome, anything that could explain what I was seeing. She suggested I talk to someone, maybe a therapist who specializes in healthcare workers. But here's what really disturbs me. I went back through the records yesterday. Every single one of those 14 patients, Arthur, Gloria, Frank, Dorothy, Christopher, Diane, all of them, were organ donors. Every single one. The hospital coordinator confirmed they all went through successful harvesting procedures, saved multiple lives with their donations. The organs were viable, healthy, functioning perfectly in their recipients. I know because I checked. I called the hospital under the pretense of following up for our quality improvement program. Now I'm sitting here at 2 a.m., writing this because I can't sleep, wondering if what I'm seeing isn't post-mortem reflexes at all. What if these people are still processing something, still present in some way we don't understand, during those crucial minutes after we call time of death? What if the reason only I can see it is something about me, some sensitivity or perception that makes me a witness to something the medical community isn't ready to acknowledge? I made a decision this morning. I'm taking a leave of absence from work, told Douglas it's for medical reasons, which isn't entirely a lie. But before I go, I need to document one more thing. I found out that Diane Fowler's organ retrieval is scheduled for tonight. They kept her on life support specifically for organ preservation, even though she was declared brain dead 3 days ago. I still have my hospital access badge, know the OR schedule, know which hallway leads to the operating room where they'll perform the retrieval. I'm not going to interfere. I would never do that. Those organs will save lives. But I need to be there. Need to see if she responds when they begin the procedure. Need to know if what I've been seeing connects to what happens in those operating rooms. The medical staff will assume I'm there for closure. It's not uncommon for first responders to follow up on difficult cases. They don't need to know about the small camera I'll have in my chest pocket, or that I've already accepted I might be recording nothing but my own breakdown. Whatever happens tonight, I'm done after this. If the footage shows nothing, I'll check myself into a psychiatric facility tomorrow, get the help everyone thinks I need. But if it shows something, anything that validates these past 6 months, then maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe there's something about the transition from life to death that we're missing. Something that only becomes visible under specific circumstances. I've spent my entire career trying to save lives, to pull people back from that edge. But maybe I've been given this perception for a different reason. Maybe someone needs to witness what happens in those moments after we stop trying, to ask whether our definition of death is as final as we believe it to be. I'll update this post tomorrow with whatever I find, assuming I'm still coherent enough to write. To anyone reading this who works in emergency medicine, have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question when death really occurs? Because I can't be the only one. There have to be others who've noticed, but stayed quiet, afraid of being labeled unstable. Tonight I'll know for sure. I'm a paramedic in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I've been doing this job for about 8 years now. Most calls become routine after a while. Cardiac arrests, overdoses, car accidents. You develop a thick skin and learn to compartmentalize. But what happened last October still keeps me up at night sometimes, wondering if there was something more I could have done, or if what we experienced even makes sense. I was working with my partner Steve, a veteran with 23 years under his belt, and even he couldn't explain what we encountered at apartment 4B on Pinewood Court. We'd just finished a 12-hour shift, and were heading back to the station when dispatch called us about an unconscious person at that address. The caller was a neighbor, Mrs. Gladwell, an elderly woman who lived in 4C, right next door. She said she'd been hearing someone groaning through the wall, like they were in pain, and she was worried someone needed help. The building was one of those converted Victorian houses from the 1940s, split into 6 units with paper-thin walls and creaky wooden floors that announced every footstep. When we arrived, Mrs. Gladwell was waiting for us in the hallway, wearing a floral nightgown and those thick-soled slippers that elderly people favor. She was wringing her hands, clearly distressed, and kept saying she could hear someone calling out weakly, like they were struggling to breathe. Steve and I pressed our ears against the door of 4B, and sure enough, we could hear it too. This low, muffled sound that definitely seemed human. We knocked hard, announced ourselves as paramedics, but got no response except for those continued groans. The building manager wasn't answering his phone, and given what we were hearing, we made the decision to force entry. Steve had the tools, and within minutes we had the door open, ready to rush in and help whoever was in distress. The apartment was completely empty. Not just empty of people, I mean bare walls, no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing. The hardwood floors were covered in a thin layer of dust that showed our footprints as we walked through. The air had that stale, closed-up smell that places get when nobody's opened a window in weeks. Steve and I searched every room, the bedroom, bathroom, even checked the closets and behind the shower curtain. There was nobody there. The windows were all locked from the inside, painted shut actually, with old paint that had yellowed and cracked over the years. We stood there in the living room, both of us confused, when Mrs. Gladwell appeared in the doorway behind us. She looked around the empty apartment with wide eyes and said, "But I heard him. I know I heard him calling for help. Where's Mr. Hendrick?" That's when she told us the tenant's name, Walter Hendrick, a man in his 70s who'd lived there alone for the past 6 years. Steve radioed dispatch to check on Walter Hendrick while I talked to Mrs. Gladwell. She insisted she'd been hearing these sounds for the past 3 days, always around the same time in the evening, between 7 and 8 p.m. She described it as a man's voice, weak and raspy, sometimes just groaning, other times actually forming words like help or please. She'd knocked on his door multiple times but never got an answer, which is why she finally called 911. While she was explaining this, Steve got a call back from dispatch that made him pull me aside. They'd run the name Walter Hendrick through the system and found a report from 3 weeks earlier. EMS had been called to this exact address for a cardiac event. The patient, Walter Hendrick, had been pronounced dead on scene. The coroner's report showed he'd likely been dead for several days before anyone found him. He died alone in this apartment, probably calling for help that never came in time. The rational part of my brain kicked in immediately. I started thinking about explanations. Maybe the sounds were coming from another apartment, maybe pipes in the walls, or even rats. Old buildings make all kinds of noises, but Mrs. Gladwell was adamant about what she'd heard, and she wasn't some confused elderly person. She was sharp, articulate, and genuinely disturbed by what she'd been hearing. Steve suggested we check with other neighbors, so we knocked on doors. The young couple in 4A hadn't heard anything unusual, but they'd only been home during the day. The man in 4D, a night shift worker named Raymond, stopped us cold when he said, "Yeah, I've been hearing it too. Started about 3 days ago. Thought someone had their TV up too loud, but it sounded exactly like someone groaning in pain. Always seemed to come from Walter's place." He hadn't known Walter was dead. The building manager had kept it quiet to avoid scaring tenants. Raymond said the sounds usually lasted about 10 to 15 minutes, then just stopped abruptly. We decided to wait. If people were hearing these sounds between 7 and 8 p.m., and it was only 6:30 now, maybe we could figure out what was really happening. Steve and I sat in the empty apartment with Mrs. Gladwell, who refused to leave despite our suggestions that she wait in her own unit. She sat on the floor near the wall she shared with the apartment, her hand pressed against it like she was trying to feel for vibrations. At 7:14 p.m., it started. First, just a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it got louder, more distinct, and I swear to God it sounded exactly like a person in distress. The sound was moving through the apartment, starting from the bedroom and traveling toward the living room where we sat. Steve jumped up and started checking everything: the radiators, the pipes behind the walls, even putting his ear to the electrical outlets. But the sound wasn't mechanical. It had the unmistakable quality of a human voice, complete with the little catches and variations that no machine or wind could replicate. Then came the words, faint but clear enough to understand. "Please, somebody help me." The voice was male, elderly, strained with effort. Mrs. Gladwell started crying, gripping my arm so hard it hurt. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Walter's voice. I've lived next to him for 6 years. We used to chat in the hallway about his grandchildren in Portland. That's his voice." Steve was pacing now, his face red with frustration. He'd been in this job long enough to see everything, but this was getting to him. The voice continued for maybe 5 more minutes, sometimes just breathing heavily, sometimes forming those same words, asking for help. We recorded it on Steve's phone, though the playback later sounded muffled and distorted, nothing like what we were hearing in person. At exactly 7:28 p.m., the sound stopped completely, like someone had flipped a switch. The apartment returned to that heavy silence, just the 3 of us breathing, and the distant sound of traffic outside. Steve called our supervisor while I contacted the building manager, finally reaching him on his cell. His name was Carl Brenner, and he confirmed that Walter Hendrick had indeed died in the apartment 3 weeks ago. The body had been discovered after Mrs. Gladwell complained about a smell. Carl said Walter had been found in the bedroom, likely dead for 4 or 5 days based on decomposition. The saddest part? They found his phone on the floor next to him, battery dead, like he'd tried to call for help but couldn't reach it in his final moments. Carl had the apartment professionally cleaned and was planning to renovate before renting it again. When I asked him about any complaints of strange noises since then, he got quiet before admitting that the cleaning crew had refused to finish the job. They'd claimed they heard someone crying in the bedroom when nobody was there, and 2 of them simply walked out and never came back. He'd had to hire a different company to complete the cleaning. We stayed in that apartment until almost 9 p.m., but the sounds didn't return. Steve and I wrote up our report, carefully documenting everything we'd witnessed, though we both knew how it would look on paper. An empty apartment, no medical emergency, no patient to transport. Just a strange occurrence with no logical explanation. Before we left, I walked through the apartment one more time, and in the bedroom, I noticed something we'd missed earlier. On the hardwood floor, there were scratch marks near the corner, like someone had been dragging their fingers across the wood. Carl later confirmed those marks weren't there when they removed Walter's body. They'd appeared sometime after, and no amount of sanding seemed to remove them completely. Mrs. Gladwell told us that Walter had been a veteran, lived alone after his wife died of cancer 5 years ago. His children lived on the West Coast and rarely visited. She said he'd been getting frail in his final months, had fallen twice in the hallway, and she'd helped him back to his apartment both times. The calls kept coming. Over the next 2 weeks, we were dispatched to that same address 4 more times. Different neighbors calling, all reporting the same thing. Someone crying for help in 4B. Each time we'd arrive to find the apartment empty, but if we waited until that window between 7 and 8 p.m., we'd hear it. Other crews from our station experienced it too. My colleague Jennifer and her partner went out there on a Saturday night and came back visibly shaken. She said they'd heard not just the voice, but what sounded like someone dragging themselves across the floor, the sound of fingernails on wood. The police got involved after the 5th call, thinking maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, hiding in the walls or using speakers. They brought in equipment, checked for hidden devices, even had a K9 unit search for anyone hiding. They found nothing. The detective in charge, a skeptical guy named Morrison, who'd been on the force for 15 years, stood in that apartment at 7:20 p.m. and heard the voice himself. His report simply stated, "Unexplained auditory phenomenon," and recommended the apartment be sealed pending further investigation. The breaking point came on a Monday evening, 11 days after our first call. This time, it wasn't a neighbor who called 911. It was Carl, the building manager. He'd gone into the apartment with a contractor to assess renovation costs when they both heard something that made them run out of the building. Carl was hyperventilating when we arrived, sitting on the curb with his head between his knees. He said the voice had been different this time, clearer, and it had said his name. "Carl, why didn't you check on me?" "Carl, I was calling for you." The contractor, a burly man named Anthony, who'd probably never run from anything in his life, was pale as a sheet. He corroborated Carl's story, said he'd heard it too, and he was done with the job. That's when Carl broke down and told us the truth. Walter had called him 3 times on the day he died. Carl saw the missed calls but didn't check his voicemail until days later, after the body was found. In the messages, Walter's voice was weak, saying he'd fallen, couldn't get up, needed help. The last message was just labored breathing. Carl had been living with the guilt, knowing that if he'd just answered his phone or checked those messages sooner, Walter might still be alive. After that Monday, everything stopped. No more sounds, no more voices, no more calls to 911. It was like whatever had been happening in that apartment had finally said what it needed to say. Carl had the unit sealed and eventually convinced the building owner to convert it into a storage space, rather than rent it out again. Mrs. Gladwell moved to her daughter's house in Virginia 2 months later, said she couldn't sleep properly knowing what had happened to Walter, knowing he'd died just a wall away from her while she was probably watching television, oblivious to his calls for help. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm on a call and someone's alone, scared, reaching out for help. There's probably a logical explanation, maybe some acoustic phenomenon, sound waves trapped in the building's structure, replaying under specific conditions. Maybe mass hysteria, though that doesn't explain what we all heard so clearly. Steve retired early last year, and when we had his farewell dinner, he pulled me aside and said that case still bothered him. Not because it was supernatural or impossible, but because it reminded him that sometimes people die calling for help that never comes. And maybe, somehow, some part of that desperation gets left behind. I don't know what we experienced in apartment 4B, but I know it was real. We all heard it. And then, once Carl's guilt was revealed, it stopped, like something had finally been acknowledged that needed to be heard. "7 months ago, I was finishing my second year as a paramedic in a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania. The job had its rough nights, sure, but nothing that really rattled me until that particular weekend in early April. I'd been partnered with a veteran EMT named Russell for about 6 months, and we'd developed a good rhythm together. He knew the city like the back of his hand, every shortcut, every hospital protocol, and he'd taught me more practical stuff than any training course ever could. That Friday started like any other night shift. We grabbed coffee from the gas station near the station house, checked our rig, and settled in for what we thought would be a typical 12-hour run. The dispatch radio crackled around 9 p.m. with our first call, a cardiac case that needed immediate transport to Riverside Medical Center, the main hospital downtown where we delivered probably 90% of our patients. The thing about Riverside Medical is that it's an old building built in sections over the decades since the 1940s. You had the original stone structure, then the glass tower they added in the 70s, and various wings and additions that made the whole place a maze if you didn't know your way around. Russell and I had just loaded our patient, an elderly man with chest pains who was stable but needed monitoring. when dispatch came through with specific instructions that made Russell pause. They told us to deliver to the cardiac unit on the 7th floor, East Wing. Now, I'd been to Riverside hundreds of times by then, and something about that instruction seemed weird. The cardiac unit I knew was on the 4th floor of the main building. Russell grabbed the radio and asked dispatch to confirm, and they repeated it clear as day. 7th floor, East Wing, they'd been notified to expect us. The patient's vitals were stable, so we didn't argue. Just figured maybe they'd moved things around or opened a new specialized unit we hadn't heard about yet. When we pulled into the ambulance bay, everything seemed normal at first. The security guard at the entrance, Eddie, who always had a joke ready for us, just waved us through without his usual banter. The automatic doors slid open, and we wheeled our patient through the familiar fluorescent-lit corridors toward the elevator bank. Russell hit the call button while I kept monitoring the old man's oxygen levels and EKG readings. The elevator arrived quickly, one of the newer ones they'd installed a few years back, and we rolled inside. Russell pressed 7, and I watched the numbers climb. 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 lit up with a soft ding. What happened next is burned into my memory because it was so completely wrong. The doors slid open smoothly, but instead of the bright hospital corridor we expected, we were facing a wall of darkness. Not dim lighting or a powered down section. I mean absolute pitch black, like staring into a cave. The temperature dropped instantly, maybe 15 or 20 degrees, and there was this smell. Stale and medical but old, like bandages that had been sitting in a closet for decades. Russell immediately hit the door close button, but they stayed open for those eternal 30 seconds that elevator doors do. I aimed my pen light into the darkness and caught glimpses of what looked like an abandoned corridor. Dust particles floating in the beam, old gurneys pushed against walls, and those ancient IV stands from the 80s with the metal hooks. The walls had that old mint green paint that hospitals used decades ago, peeling and water-stained in places. Our patient started getting agitated, his heart rate spiking on the monitor, asking what was happening, where we were taking him. Russell was already on his radio, trying to reach dispatch, but all we got was static, which never happened inside Riverside. The elevator doors finally started closing, and Russell quickly pressed 4, taking us back down to the cardiac unit we actually knew. Neither of us said anything for a moment, just exchanged this look that said we'd both seen the same impossible thing. The patient's vitals were climbing, so we focused on keeping him calm, telling him we'd just had a little confusion with the floors. Nothing to worry about. We delivered the patient to the actual cardiac unit on the 4th floor without any further issues. The charge nurse, Bethany, took him right away, and while she was getting him settled, Russell pulled me aside and asked if I wanted to report what just happened. But report what exactly? That an elevator took us to what looked like an abandoned floor. We both knew how that would sound. Instead, Russell suggested we talk to Eddie on our way out, maybe ask casually if there'd been any construction or changes to the 7th floor. Eddie just looked at us funny when we brought it up, said the East Wing only went up to 6 floors. Always had since he'd been working there for 15 years. The 7th floor of the main building was administrative offices, he said. No patient areas at all. Russell and I didn't push it, just headed back to our rig, but I could tell we were both processing what we'd experienced. The rest of that shift was quiet, normal calls, normal deliveries, but that 7th floor thing sat between us like a third passenger we couldn't acknowledge. The next night, Saturday, we were back on shift, and around 11 p.m., we got another call that made my chest tighten. Dispatch directed us to transport a stroke patient to Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing Neurology Unit. Russell and I locked eyes across the rig. He picked up the radio real careful and asked dispatch to repeat the destination. Same thing, 7th floor, East Wing, Neurology had a bed ready and waiting. This time, Russell pushed back, told dispatch that the East Wing only had 6 floors. Could they please verify? There was a pause, maybe 10 seconds of dead air. Then dispatch came back sounding confused, saying they were just reading what was in the system. but they double-check with the hospital. A minute later, they corrected, "Patient should go to the 6th floor neurology unit." We delivered that patient without incident, but when we checked with the 6th floor nurses, none of them had heard anything about a 7th floor unit. One older nurse must have been there for 30 years, gave us this strange look when we mentioned it and just shook her head, walking away without saying anything. Sunday night was when things got genuinely disturbing. We'd had a busy evening, 3 calls back to back, and around 2 a.m. we were transporting a young woman who'd been in a car accident, conscious but with potential internal injuries that needed immediate evaluation. Dispatch came through crystal clear: Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing, trauma unit. By now, Russell and I had developed a routine. He'd immediately radio back for clarification, while I documented everything in my notebook: times, exact words, everything. But this time, dispatch insisted. They said they'd confirmed directly with Riverside the trauma team was waiting on 7 East. The woman we were transporting was getting scared, picking up on our hesitation, so Russell made the call to just head to Riverside and take her to the regular ER. But when we arrived and rolled into the elevator, something different happened. I pressed the lobby button, planning to check with information first, but the elevator started moving on its own. The display showed we were going up, 1, 2, 3, and it wouldn't respond to any buttons we pressed. At the 7th floor, the doors opened to that same darkness, but this time we heard something that made my whole body go rigid. From somewhere deep in that black corridor came the sound of monitors beeping, that steady rhythm of heart monitors and ventilators, dozens of them, all slightly out of sync, creating this horrible cacophony. And underneath that, barely audible, was a voice on an intercom calling out room numbers and doctor names I'd never heard before. Our patient started crying, begging us not to take her in there, and honestly, I was ready to carry her down the stairs if I had to. Russell jammed his hand between the closing doors to keep them open, while frantically hitting the emergency button. The beeping got louder, and I swear the air coming from that corridor was even colder than before, with this smell like old rubber and something else, something organic and wrong. The elevator suddenly lurched, the doors forced themselves closed despite Russell's attempts, and we descended straight to the ER level without stopping. Security was there when the doors opened, 2 guards who said they'd gotten an alert about a stuck elevator, but the elevator had only been stopped for maybe 30 seconds according to their systems. After we got that patient safely to the ER and finished our shift, Russell did something I didn't expect. He went to the hospital's administrative office that morning and asked to see old building records. He had a cousin who worked in facilities management, and she let us look through some archived blueprints and documents during her break. What we found made everything infinitely worse. There had been a 7th floor in the East Wing, built in 1979 as a state-of-the-art ICU with the latest equipment for critical care. All the paperwork was there: construction permits, equipment purchases, staff assignments. Then we found a newspaper clipping from August 1987 that Russell's cousin had tucked into the files. During a summer storm, the hospital's backup generators had failed, and the 7th floor lost power for 14 hours. 43 patients died that night, all of them on ventilators or life support that failed when the power went out. The families sued, there was a massive investigation, and ultimately the hospital board decided to seal off the entire floor rather than renovate it. They removed it from the elevator system, blocked the stairwell access, and essentially erased it from the building's official layout. But here's what really disturbed us. Russell's cousin pulled up the current dispatch system on her computer, and there it was in the drop-down menu for Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing, with options for different units. She tried to delete it, said it must be some old data that never got purged, but the system wouldn't let her. Every time she removed it, it would reappear within seconds. She even called IT while we were standing there, and they remoted into her computer, tried to trace where this phantom floor data was coming from. The IT tech got really quiet after a few minutes and said he'd have to escalate this, that the entries were being generated by user accounts that had been deactivated for decades. The original dispatch operators from the 1980s whose login credentials somehow were still creating automated entries in the modern system. Russell asked how that was possible, and the tech just said sometimes old hospital systems had redundancies and backups that nobody remembered, ghost data that lived in servers that hadn't been properly decommissioned. That evening was my last shift at Riverside. We'd gotten through most of the night without any calls to the hospital, when around 4 a.m., dispatch sent us for an elderly man with breathing difficulties. The destination came through before we even reached the patient. Riverside Medical, 7th floor East Wing, respiratory unit. Russell and I didn't even discuss it this time. We picked up the patient, stabilized him, and drove straight to County Medical 15 minutes further away, telling dispatch we'd had to divert due to traffic. But during that drive, something happened that still makes me sick to think about. The patient, who'd been barely conscious when we loaded him, suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes were wide and unfocused, and he kept repeating a room number. 7E42, 7E42, said his wife was waiting for him there, that he needed to get to 7E42. Russell looked up that room number later in those old hospital records. Room 7E42 had been occupied by a woman named Helen Garrett who died in the 1987 power failure. Our patient's last name was Garrett. We delivered him to County Medical, but he passed away 3 hours later. The attending physician said it was expected given his age and condition, but the way he'd been so insistent about that room number, it felt like something had been calling him to a place that didn't exist anymore, at least not in any way we understand. I transferred to a different company the next week, one that doesn't service Riverside Medical. Russell stayed on for another month before taking early retirement, something he'd been planning anyway, he said, though I knew better. Before I left, we filed a formal report about the elevator and dispatch system issues, recommended a full IT audit and safety review. The hospital's response was that they'd found no technical irregularities but would update their systems as a precaution. But here's the thing. I still keep in touch with other paramedics in the area, and every few weeks someone mentions getting those 7th floor calls. They always get corrected now. Dispatchers immediately revise them to the 6th floor or the main building. But those initial calls keep coming through. Whatever's happening with that floor, whether it's old computer systems, electromagnetic interference from abandoned equipment, or something else entirely, it's still active. The hospital announced plans last month to demolish the entire East Wing and rebuild it, but construction keeps getting delayed. The latest excuse was that they found asbestos, but a contractor friend told me the real reason. They can't figure out how to safely access the 7th floor to prep it for demolition. Every time workers try to break through the sealed stairwells, their equipment fails, batteries drain, and 3 workers have reportedly quit after hearing those monitor alarms echoing through the walls. "23 years as a paramedic in Austin, Texas, and I thought I'd seen everything. You get jaded after a while. Overdoses, car wrecks, domestic violence calls that turn ugly. My partner Brett and I worked the night shift, which meant we got the weird stuff, the drunk calls, the lonely elderly folks who just needed someone to talk to. It was a Wednesday in July 2023, around 2 a.m., when dispatch crackled through our radio about a cardiac arrest at 4782 Birchwood Lane. Standard procedure, lights and sirens, Brett navigating while I checked our equipment. The address seemed familiar, but at that hour, everything blurs together. We'd been pulling 12-hour shifts all week, and the exhaustion made everything feel like déjà vu. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, completely dark except for our ambulance lights painting red and blue across its peeling white siding. No porch light, no movement behind the windows, no car in the cracked driveway that had grass growing through the concrete like green veins. Brett grabbed the jump bag while I wheeled out the gurney, both of us moving fast, but something felt wrong about the silence. Usually someone meets you at the door, a panicked spouse, a neighbor who heard commotion, somebody. But there was nothing, just our equipment rattling and the distant hum of the highway 2 blocks over. I pounded on the front door hard enough to wake the whole street, announced ourselves as EMS, waited for any response. The door was locked, no answer, and when Brett shined his flashlight through the front window, we could see an empty living room with a thick layer of dust on the floor. Undisturbed like fresh snow, we circled the house, checking every window, every door, looking for any sign of life or forced entry. The backyard was overgrown, waist-high weeds that hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. An old swing set stood rusted in the corner, one swing hanging by a single chain like a broken arm. Brett called dispatch to confirm the address while I kept searching, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. They confirmed it. 4782 Birchwood Lane. Caller reported chest pains, difficulty breathing, said they were alone and couldn't get to the door. The dispatcher, Nancy, sounded confused too. She said the caller's voice was clear, not muffled or distant, and they'd given this exact address twice when asked to confirm. But standing there in that abandoned backyard, listening to crickets and looking at windows covered in grime, we both knew nobody had called from this house. The next-door neighbor's lights flicked on, and an elderly man in a bathrobe shuffled onto his porch, squinting at us through thick glasses. He told us nobody had lived in that house for at least 3 years, not since the Dawson family moved to Michigan. The house was supposed to be on the market, but the realtor had trouble selling it, something about foundation issues and outdated electrical. He seemed irritated that we'd woken him up, kept asking if we were sure we had the right address. Brett showed him the call information on his tablet, and the old man just shrugged, said maybe someone was playing pranks, kids breaking in to make false calls. But there were no broken windows, no jimmied locks, no footprints in the dust when we looked through the windows again. We spent another 15 minutes searching before dispatch called us away to a real emergency, a motorcycle accident on the interstate. 2 nights later, same thing. This time it was around 4 a.m., and dispatch sounded apologetic when they called us. Same address, same reported symptoms, chest pains, trouble breathing, elderly male caller who said he couldn't make it to the door. Nancy was on dispatch again, and she swore the call was legitimate. Came through the 911 system just like any other call. The caller ID showed the landline number registered to 4782 Birchwood Lane. Brett and I exchanged looks when we heard the address. We'd already discussed the weird call with our supervisor, who'd written it off as a technical glitch, maybe crossed wires or someone spoofing the phone system. But here we were again, pulling up to that same dark house with its overgrown lawn and empty driveway. This time we brought the police with us. Officer Daniels and his partner arrived right after we did, and together we went through the same routine, knocking, announcing ourselves, circling the property with our flashlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Daniels managed to contact the property owner, some investment company based in Houston that bought it from the bank after foreclosure. They confirmed the house was vacant, had been empty since they acquired it 18 months ago. The electricity had been shut off for non-payment before that, and the phone service was supposedly disconnected at the same time. Yet when Nancy played back the 911 recording for us later, we could all hear it clear as day. An elderly man's voice, strained but articulate, giving the address and describing classic heart attack symptoms. The voice sounded local, had that distinctive Central Texas drawl, not like a recording or computer generation. He even answered Nancy's follow-up questions appropriately, said he was 78 years old, lived alone, had a history of heart problems. When she asked him to stay on the line, he said he would. But then the line went silent, though the connection stayed open for another 3 minutes before cutting off. The calls kept coming, not every night, but often enough that dispatch started documenting everything, building a case file. Sometimes it was twice a week, sometimes we'd go 10 days without one, then get 3 calls in 2 nights. Always between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., always the same elderly male voice, always reporting cardiac symptoms. The details would vary slightly. Sometimes he'd mention chest pressure, other times radiating pain in his left arm, occasionally shortness of breath and dizziness. But the voice was consistent, and he always gave the same age, same address. Always said he lived alone. The phone company got involved after the fifth call, sent technicians out during daylight hours. They confirmed what we already knew. No active service, lines physically disconnected at the pole, the interior phone jacks dead when they tested them. They even checked for illegal connections, thinking maybe someone had tapped into the line somehow, but found nothing. The whole system was as dead as the house itself. Brett started recording everything on his personal phone, documenting each call out. He became obsessed with finding an explanation, spent his off hours researching phone phreaking, VoIP spoofing, any technical way someone could fake these calls. But every expert he talked to said the same thing. If the physical line was disconnected at the pole, there was no way a call could originate from that number through the traditional 911 system. The police set up surveillance one night, had a unit parked across the street for a full week. Nothing. No movement, no lights, no sign of anyone entering or leaving the property. But on night 6 of their surveillance, the call came through again. The officer watched the house the entire time, swore on his badge that nobody was inside. No lights came on. Nothing moved. Yet Nancy had another recording of that same elderly voice, gasping this time, saying his chest felt like an elephant was sitting on it, begging for help. I started digging into the history of the house on my own time, spending hours at the county records office and online. The Dawson family, who'd lived there last, were a young couple with 2 kids, moved for a job opportunity. Nothing unusual there. Before them, the house had changed hands several times over the years, typical for the neighborhood. But then I found something that made me pause. In August 2016, a man named Leonard Hutchins had owned the property. 78 years old, lived alone after his wife died. History of cardiac problems. He died in the house. A massive heart attack, the coroner's report said. A neighbor found him 3 days later after newspapers piled up on his driveway. The report noted he'd been found near the phone in the hallway, receiver off the hook. The 911 logs from that night showed no call from his address. He'd died trying to reach the phone, probably grabbed it as he went down but never managed to dial. The calls suddenly stopped after we found this information. Not gradually, not tapering off. They just stopped. The last one came on a Monday morning in August, exactly 7 years to the day after Leonard Hutchins died. I was there for that final call, heard Nancy's side of the conversation, watched her face go pale as she listened. She said this call was different. The voice was the same, but calmer. No panic or pain in it. He simply said, "Thank you for coming," and hung up. We still responded, had to follow protocol, but I knew we wouldn't find anything. The house stood empty as always, dust undisturbed, no sign anyone had been inside for years. The phone company came back one more time, removed the physical line from the pole entirely, took out all the equipment. The investment company eventually sold the property, and a young family renovated it completely, gutted it down to the studs, and rebuilt. I drive past that house sometimes when I'm working that side of town. The new family has painted it yellow with white trim, planted a garden, installed a modern doorbell system with a camera. Kids' toys scatter the front yard, and warm light spills from the windows at night. They seem happy, unaware of what happened before they moved in. I've never told them about the calls, figured there was no point in disturbing their peace. Brett transferred to day shift 6 months after the calls stopped, said he needed a change, but I know it bothered him that we never found a logical explanation. Nancy still works dispatch, and we've never talked about it directly. But sometimes when a cardiac call comes in during those early morning hours, I hear a slight hesitation in her voice when she reads the address, like she's checking twice to make sure it's real. The department's official report lists it as a technical anomaly, possibly someone using sophisticated equipment to spoof calls, case closed due to cessation of activity. But I know what I heard in those recordings, and I've worked enough cardiac arrests to recognize genuine distress in someone's voice. Whatever explanation people want to accept, Crossed wires, electromagnetic interference, someone's elaborate prank. The fact remains that for several months, someone or something made those calls from a disconnected phone in an empty house. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, never have. But I can't explain what happened at 4782 Birchwood Lane. All I know is that somewhere in those early morning hours, someone was calling for help, and we kept showing up even when there was nobody there to save. Maybe that's all that mattered in the end. That someone answered, that someone came, even 7 years too late. Back when I was working full-time as a paramedic in the downtown district, my life revolved around 12-hour shifts, endless coffee, and the constant ring of dispatch alerts. I lived in a small apartment not far from the station, barely saw my neighbors, and spent most of my free time either catching up on sleep or grabbing late-night takeout. The city itself always felt restless, like it never really went quiet, even at 3 a.m. That year, I was partnered with Daniel, a guy with a dry sense of humor and a talent for staying calm no matter how chaotic the call got. We had handled just about everything together: overdoses in alleys, traffic accidents on jam-packed streets, even the occasional warehouse fire evacuation. But one call stands out in my memory, and it still makes me uneasy when I think back on it. The first time we were dispatched to that office building, the call came in as a possible cardiac arrest inside one of the elevators. It was late afternoon, a weekday, and the streets outside the building were buzzing with people heading home. Security met us at the front entrance, pale and sweating, pointing us straight to the elevator bank. He said a woman had called 911 screaming that her coworker collapsed inside the elevator between the 9th and 10th floor. When the door slid open in front of us, the cab was completely empty. No one was inside. Not a briefcase, not a single dropped item, just the faint hum of the overhead light. We exchanged a look, half expecting someone to be slumped in the corner and somehow invisible at first glance, but the space was spotless. We chalked it up to a prank call or maybe a misunderstanding, but within a week we were sent back. This time the report said 2 people had fainted in the elevator, again between the 9th and 10th floors. Same routine. We rushed up with the stretcher, pried the doors open, and once again, nothing. The stainless steel walls reflected our confused faces, and the faint smell of cleaning supplies hung in the air like the janitors had just been through. No signs of struggle, no dropped purses or jackets, just silence. Daniel muttered that maybe kids had found a way to mess with the emergency call system, but I could see his unease. Dispatch doesn't usually get fooled twice in the same spot. The third call was different. By then, we were already rolling our eyes when the building's address came across the radio. But this time, the report mentioned an older man clutching his chest inside the elevator. We moved fast, adrenaline kicking in, only to arrive and find the doors already pried open by security. Once again, the cab was vacant. The guard on duty swore he had watched the elevator stall on the security feed with someone inside, and then nothing. He replayed the footage for us later, but the screen went grainy right as the figure inside leaned against the wall. When the picture cleared, the elevator was empty. That was the night I started asking questions about the building. Later that week, I cornered one of the maintenance guys in the lobby, a stocky man named Leonard, who smelled constantly of machine oil. When I asked about the elevator, he gave me this strange look and said flat out, "That thing's been shut down for years. We don't even have power running to it." At first, I thought he was joking, but the way his hand stayed shoved deep in his coveralls told me he wasn't. He explained that years earlier, a man had suffered a fatal cardiac event inside that same elevator. The place was busy, and somehow no one noticed the cab had stalled. By the time anyone found him, hours had passed. After that, the building owners ordered the elevator locked down permanently. Hearing that sent a chill through me, because it didn't match what we'd been responding to. If the elevator was shut down, then where were the calls coming from? Leonard swore up and down that the emergency line inside had been disconnected, and he even showed me the panel in the basement with wires clipped neatly. The building had 4 other working elevators, all with their call systems intact, so there was no reason for false signals to come from the sealed one. Still, dispatch logs clearly showed multiple distress calls originating from that shaft. It didn't add up, and the longer I thought about it, the less I could dismiss it as a prank. A few nights later, we got another call, same building, same story. I remember riding the working elevator up with Daniel, both of us unusually quiet, listening to the soft whine of the cables overhead. When the doors opened on the 10th floor, the lights in the hallway flickered, just once, like someone had flipped a switch too fast. Security was waiting for us again, wide-eyed, pointing to the sealed elevator as if expecting us to pry it open. We all stood there, listening. Faintly, from inside the locked cab, came the sound of muffled coughing followed by a weak thump, like someone collapsing against the wall. Daniel banged on the doors, shouting for whoever was inside to hang on, but his voice just echoed through the shaft. The guard swore he heard it too, and even radioed to the control room to check the cameras. They reported the same thing. The elevator had stalled between floors and the feed showed a man slumped in the corner. Yet when we forced the doors open with the emergency key, the cab was spotless. No man, no sign of struggle, just the faint metallic tang in the air, almost like old blood. I don't scare easily on the job, but that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were answering calls that should never have existed. Word spread among the crew that Daniel and I kept getting the phantom elevator calls. Some joked about it, others avoided talking about it altogether. Dispatch eventually flagged the address so that any call from that building would get routed straight to our unit, almost like they wanted consistency in who dealt with it. That night, we got another ping. Possible fainting inside the elevator, same floor range. By then, the whole thing had taken on this strange ritual. Security guiding us to the locked doors, the faint noise inside, and the empty cab waiting. But this time, when we arrived, the building manager was there too, sweating through his tie and visibly shaken. He begged us not to go up, insisting there was no way the call was real. We went anyway. The manager trailed behind us, muttering about liability and bad publicity. The elevator doors on the 9th floor were closed tight, but from inside we all heard it. A low, desperate moan followed by the faint click of the emergency phone being lifted. Daniel and I exchanged a look, and before either of us said a word, the manager shoved an old brass key into my hand. He admitted it was the master key for the sealed elevator, something he claimed hadn't been used in over a decade. I slid it into the slot, turned it, and the doors slowly creaked apart. The cab was pitch dark. We aimed our flashlights inside, and that's when I saw it, clear as day for maybe 3 seconds. A man in a crumpled gray suit leaned against the back wall, his mouth open as if trying to breathe, one hand clutching his chest. His skin looked drained, waxy, and his eyes locked onto mine like he was begging for help. Daniel shouted, "Sir!" and stepped forward, but in the blink of an eye, the cab was empty again. Just 4 blank walls and the buzzing of our flashlights against the steel. The manager gasped and backed away, insisting we close it back up. He looked like he might faint himself. After that night, the building owners ordered the entire elevator bank sealed behind steel panels. Dispatch stopped getting calls from that address, almost like whatever was reaching out had finally been cut off. Daniel and I never got another phantom call again, but I'll never forget that man's eyes staring right at me in the beam of my flashlight. People sometimes ask if I believe in ghosts, and I usually laugh it off. But when I pass that office tower, I can't help but wonder if someone is still waiting inside that locked elevator, reaching for a phone that isn't even connected anymore. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My daughter Haley had just turned 3 that September, and we were still adjusting to life in this old house outside Stillwater. At 24, raising her alone felt overwhelming most days, especially after her dad disappeared 6 months earlier without even a goodbye text. We'd found this place through a coworker at Dollar General. 2 bedrooms, peeling white paint, sitting at the end of a gravel road about 2 miles from anybody else. The isolation didn't bother me much since the rent was only $400 a month, and there was a decent backyard surrounded by tall prairie grass and scraggly oak trees that creaked against the roof on windy nights. Most evenings followed the same routine. Pick up Haley from my mom's place after work, make something simple for dinner, fight through bath time while she splashed water all over the bathroom floor, then read her exactly 3 stories before she'd finally close her eyes around 8:30. That particular evening in early October started exactly like that. Chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, bubbles everywhere during her bath, and her favorite book about a rabbit who gets lost in the woods. After tucking Haley in with her stuffed elephant named Peanut, I collapsed onto our second-hand couch with some reheated coffee and my phone, grateful for a few minutes of quiet. The house had this way of settling at night, little pops and creaks that I'd gotten used to over the past 4 months of living there. But around 9:15, I heard something different coming from the kitchen. The back door handle was rattling, this metallic clicking sound that didn't match the usual house noises. That door was original to the house, probably from the 60s. Solid wood on the bottom with 9 small glass panes on top, the kind with frosted privacy glass that only showed shapes and shadows. The deadbolt barely caught in the frame anymore, and I kept meaning to ask the landlord to fix it. For maybe 30 seconds, I sat there listening to that handle jiggle, telling myself it had to be the wind. Then everything went quiet for a moment. And that's when I heard them. 3 heavy knocks, slow and deliberate, each one making the glass panes vibrate slightly. Through the doorway to the kitchen, I could see the edge of that door, and a dark shadow moved across those frosted panes, blocking out the dim porch light. The shadow wasn't moving like someone just passing by or a delivery person checking addresses. It lingered there, shifting slightly from side to side like whoever it was kept leaning in to peer through different panes of glass. My first instinct was to call out and ask who was there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the deliberate way those knocks had sounded, or how late it was for anyone to be visiting. I slipped off the couch as quietly as I could, keeping my eyes on that doorway while I grabbed my phone from the coffee table. The kitchen light was off, which meant whoever was outside couldn't see in clearly, but it also meant I'd have to get closer to see anything more than that shadow. I crept toward the kitchen, staying close to the wall, my bare feet silent on the carpet, and then the cold linoleum. When I reached the door frame, I pressed myself against it and slowly leaned around to get a better view. The shadow had moved to the far left pane now, and I could make out what looked like hands cupped around someone's face, trying to see inside. That's when the handle started turning. Not rattling anymore, actually turning, slowly, testing whether the door was locked. The deadbolt held, but I could hear it straining against the frame, that old wood creaking under pressure. I pulled back from the doorway and held my breath, thumb hovering over my phone's emergency call button. The turning stopped, followed by silence that stretched for maybe 10 seconds. Then came a different sound, scratching like metal on wood, coming from lower on the door near the handle. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking anymore. They were working at something, and the systematic nature of those sounds made my chest tighten. I thought about Haley sleeping in her room just down the hall, completely unaware, clutching Peanut with her mouth slightly open the way she always slept. The scratching continued for another minute before stopping abruptly, and the shadow disappeared from the glass panes. But I didn't hear footsteps walking away on the wooden porch or crunching on the gravel path that led to our driveway. I stayed frozen against that wall for what must have been 5 minutes just listening. The refrigerator hummed its usual tune, The oak tree outside scraped against the roof, but nothing from the back porch. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was someone drunk who got the wrong house, or teenagers playing a prank, though we lived too far out for random pranks. Then I remembered something that made my mouth go dry. The previous tenant, an older woman named Dolores, according to my landlord, had moved out suddenly after living here for years. He'd been vague about why, just said she needed to be closer to family. I'd found some of her mail still coming to the house, even some prescription bottles in the medicine cabinet that I'd thrown away. What if someone was looking for her, someone who didn't know she'd moved? Or worse, what if they did know and thought a young woman living alone would be an easier target? A soft thud from the side of the house snapped me back to the present. My bedroom window faced that direction, and it was cracked open about 2 inches to let in the cool night air. I backed away from the kitchen doorway and hurried down the hall, still trying to stay quiet. Phone clutched in my hand with 911 already typed but not called. I reached my bedroom door and slowly pushed it open, peering into the darkness. The window screen was moving slightly, pushed inward like something had pressed against it from outside. Through the gap under the raised window, I could hear breathing, slow, controlled breaths that definitely weren't wind. Someone was standing right outside my bedroom window, probably on the old wooden crate I'd left there from when I'd been trying to fix the gutter. The breathing continued, steady and patient, and then I heard fingers running along the screen, testing its edges, looking for a way to pop it out of the frame. Every instinct screamed at me to grab Haley and run, but run where? My car keys were on the kitchen counter right by that back door where this had all started. The front door was in the living room, but it led out to the same gravel driveway where this person could easily see us. I pressed call on my phone, turning the volume down as low as possible while the dispatcher answered. Whispering as quietly as I could, I gave our address, 4782 County Road 51, and explained someone was trying to break in. The dispatcher, a woman with a calm voice, told me deputies were on their way, but it would be at least 15 minutes given our location. 15 minutes. The fingers stopped moving along the screen and I heard the wooden crate creak as weight shifted on it. Then came a sound that nearly made me scream, the window itself being pushed up, slow and careful. I'd forgotten to lock it after opening it earlier, and now it was sliding up inch by inch, the old wood frame groaning softly. I backed out of the bedroom and rushed to Haley's room, scooping her up as gently as I could while she stayed deep in sleep. She mumbled something about pancakes but didn't wake up, her small body warm and limp in my arms. Carrying her and Peanut, I went to the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock on the door, even if it was just a flimsy push-button one. I locked us in and sat on the closed toilet lid with Haley in my lap, rocking her slightly to keep her asleep while listening to every sound in the house. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking for updates in a hushed voice that I could barely hear. From the bathroom, I heard my bedroom window slide the rest of the way open, then nothing for about 30 seconds. After that came the unmistakable sound of feet hitting my bedroom floor, 2 soft thuds as someone climbed inside. The footsteps were careful but not silent, work boots maybe, moving across my bedroom toward the hallway. They paused at my doorway, and I held Haley tighter, praying she wouldn't wake up and make any noise. The footsteps moved down the hall toward the kitchen, and I heard drawers being opened. Not ransacked, but searched through methodically. The silverware drawer rattled, then the junk drawer where I kept batteries and random screws. Cabinet doors opened and closed with careful precision. This wasn't some desperate burglar grabbing valuables. This person was looking for something specific. The dispatcher whispered that deputies were 8 minutes out, and I whispered back what was happening. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, don't engage. Like I had any intention of confronting whoever this was while holding my 3-year-old. The searching sounds moved to the living room. I could hear the coffee table being moved, couch cushions being lifted. Then the footsteps came back down the hall, slower this time, and stopped right outside the bathroom door. The doorknob turned slightly, testing it, and found it locked. There was a long pause, Maybe 20 seconds of absolute silence except for my heart pounding so hard, I was sure they could hear it through the door. Then came a voice, male, gravelly like someone who'd smoked for decades. "Dolores, I know you're in there. Just give me back what you took and I'll leave. Nobody needs to get hurt." The wrong name, the wrong person, but the threat was clear enough. I stayed silent, holding Haley against my chest, her breath warm on my neck. The dispatcher was saying something, but I couldn't focus on her words. The man spoke again, louder. "Don't make this difficult. You've had 6 months to think about it. That money belongs to me, not you." He rattled the doorknob harder, and I heard him lean against the door, testing its strength. The bathroom door was hollow core, the kind you could probably punch through if you really wanted to. "I saw your car. I know you're home. And I know you've got someone in there with you. I heard you talking." My throat constricted as I realized he meant the dispatcher. He thought I was Dolores, hiding in here with someone else, and nothing I could say would probably convince him otherwise without revealing that a young mother and toddler were actually behind this flimsy door. The doorknob rattled violently now, and I heard him throw his shoulder against the door. The frame shook, and I saw the lock button wiggle. Haley stirred in my arms, making a small whimpering sound, and I quickly started humming softly in her ear, the same tune I used when she had nightmares. The man must have heard something because he stopped. "You got a kid in there, Dolores? That's low, even for you. Using a kid as a shield." His voice had changed, uncertain now, maybe even confused. The dispatcher was saying the deputies were 3 minutes out, but 3 minutes felt like a lifetime. Outside the bathroom, I heard him pace a few steps, muttering something I couldn't make out. Then his footsteps moved quickly down the hall toward my bedroom, the window he'd come through. I heard him climbing back out, the wooden crate scraping against the house siding, and then feet hitting the ground outside. Still holding the phone, I whispered to the dispatcher that he was leaving through the bedroom window. "She told me to stay put until deputies arrived. Don't leave the bathroom no matter what." 2 minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder as they turned onto our gravel road. The dispatcher confirmed they were pulling up to the house, and only then did I finally breathe properly. Haley woke up when the deputies knocked on the front door, confused and cranky, asking why we were in the bathroom. I carried her out, legs shaking so badly I could barely walk, and let the officers in. They searched the entire property with flashlights while one deputy, a young guy named Officer Brennan, took my statement. When they checked the back door, they found deep pry marks all around the deadbolt and frame. He'd been working at it with some kind of tool before moving to the window. On my bedroom floor, they found muddy boot prints and, strangest of all, an old photograph that must have fallen from his pocket. It showed Dolores, recognizable from the mail I'd seen, standing next to a man who looked like he could have been her son or nephew. Officer Brennan bagged it as evidence and said they'd try to track down Dolores to figure out what this was about. They stayed until dawn, and I spent the rest of that night packing our things. We moved in with my mom the next day, and I never went back except to get the rest of our stuff with my brother and cousin present. The landlord said he understood and didn't charge me for breaking the lease. I found out later from Officer Brennan that they'd located Dolores in Arkansas. She'd apparently been taking care of her adult son with mental health issues, who'd been stealing from people to feed a gambling addiction. She'd taken his stash of stolen cash when she left, trying to return it to victims, but he'd tracked her down to the wrong place. They arrested him 2 weeks later at a motel near Tulsa. I still check every lock twice before bed, and Haley, now 5, doesn't understand why Mommy doesn't like it when people knock on doors after dark. The farmhouse sat 40 miles outside Billings, surrounded by wheat fields that rippled like water whenever the wind blew hard enough. My parents had moved to Phoenix for Dad's arthritis, but kept the property as a rental, and since it was between tenants that June, they offered it to me while I worked on my senior thesis. Montana State felt a million miles away out there, which was exactly what I needed after 3 years of dorm life and lecture halls. The isolation wrapped around me like a blanket those first few weeks. Just the creaking bones of that old house, the whisper of wheat stalks, and old Mr. Garrison's pickup truck rattling past once a day on the gravel road. 12 acres of nothing but peace, with the nearest real neighbor a half-mile away. My laptop and a stack of research books took over the kitchen table, and I fell into a routine that felt almost meditative. My old bedroom on the second floor faced the backyard, where this massive oak tree threw shadows across the walls at night, like long fingers reaching for something. The house had been built in the 50s, all hardwood floors that announced every step, and windows that rattled in their frames when storms rolled through. For 2 weeks, the days blurred together beautifully. Coffee from Mom's ancient percolator at 8, research and writing until my eyes burned, then frozen dinners while trying to stream something on internet that barely functioned. By 11 each night, I'd crawl into bed feeling accomplished and exhausted in the best way. But around the 3rd week of June, sleep started breaking apart. I'd snap awake at 2, sometimes 3 in the morning, heart pounding like I'd been running, skin prickling with this electric feeling that made every shadow in the room seem important somehow. At first, I blamed the coffee. Then the stress of my thesis deadline creeping closer. Maybe it was just the house settling in new ways, or coyotes passing through the property. Dad had mentioned they sometimes came close to the house hunting for mice in the barn. But the feeling kept getting stronger, more specific. It wasn't just waking up anxious. It was waking up feeling observed, like when you sense someone reading over your shoulder at the library. The sensation always centered on my bedroom window, the one facing the backyard. During the day, that window was my favorite feature of the room, letting in morning light that made everything golden. But at night, with nothing but darkness pressing against the glass, it became something else entirely. I started leaving the curtains closed, telling myself it was to block the morning sun, not because of how exposed that rectangle of black glass made me feel. The 4th week brought a heat wave that turned the farmhouse into an oven. Even with every window open and 2 box fans running, the upstairs felt unbearable. On Wednesday night, I remember it was Wednesday because I'd driven to town that afternoon for groceries, I gave up trying to sleep around 1:30. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and that familiar prickle of anxiety was already crawling up my spine. I sat up, debating whether to grab my pillow and try sleeping on the couch downstairs, when I heard something that made me go completely still. Outside, maybe 20 feet from the house, came the distinct sound of a throat clearing. Not a cough exactly, but that deliberate noise someone makes when they want you to know they're there. The sound was so casual, so human, that for a second I thought maybe Mr. Garrison had come by, though I couldn't imagine why he'd be in my backyard at this hour. I crept to the window, staying low, and peeked through the gap where the curtain didn't quite meet the wall. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in this silver-blue light that made the yard look like an old photograph. The oak tree's shadow stretched across the grass, and beyond that the wheat field began, stalks barely moving in the still air. Nothing seemed wrong at first glance. Then I saw him. A man stood at the edge of the property line, where the mowed grass met the wheat. He was facing my window, completely motionless, arms hanging loose at his sides. Even from the second floor I could tell he was tall, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", wearing what looked like work clothes, jeans and a light-colored shirt. His face was just a pale oval in the moonlight, but somehow I knew he was looking directly at me, even though I was hidden behind the curtain. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, me crouched by the window, him standing in my yard like he'd grown roots. Then he took a step forward. Just one step, slow and deliberate, like he was testing something. My whole body locked up, this primal fear flooding through me that made thinking impossible. He took another step, then another, moving toward the house with this strange, measured pace, like someone walking through water. When he reached the oak tree about 15 feet from the house, he stopped. His head tilted back slightly, and I realized he was looking up at my window more directly now. That's when I noticed the cigarette. The orange glow appeared suddenly as he took a drag, illuminating his face for just a second. I couldn't make out features clearly, but I saw enough. Hollow cheeks, deep-set eyes, and something wrong with his mouth, like he was smiling but only with one side of his face. He stood there smoking, never moving except to raise and lower the cigarette, keeping his eyes fixed on my window the entire time. My phone was on the nightstand, just 5 feet away, but moving meant risking him seeing me. I tried to control my breathing, these shallow little gasps that made my chest ache, while my mind raced through options. Call 911, run downstairs and lock myself in the bathroom, get to my car keys in the kitchen. Every plan seemed to end with me having to move, to reveal that I was awake and watching him. The cigarette glowed brighter as he took a long drag, and then he did something that made bile rise in my throat. He waved. Not a friendly wave, but this slow, deliberate movement of his hand, back and forth like he was cleaning a window. The gesture was so wrong, so out of place in the middle of the night, that I actually gasped out loud. His head snapped toward the sound immediately, that lopsided smile stretching wider. He knew exactly where I was. He'd known the whole time. The spell broke and I scrambled backward, grabbing my phone and punching in 911 with fingers that wouldn't work right. The dispatcher's voice sounded impossibly calm as I whispered that someone was in my yard, that I needed help now, please. He's just standing there watching me. She kept asking questions. Was I safe? Was the house locked? Could I describe the person? While I crawled to the hallway, staying below the window line. Through the thin walls, I heard something that made my situation so much worse. Footsteps on the wooden porch below, slow and heavy, testing each board like he was savoring the sound. The doorknob to the back door rattled once, twice, then stopped. I heard him walking around the house, pausing at each window, and I realized with sick certainty that I hadn't checked any of the locks before going to bed. The dispatcher was saying units were on their way, 15 minutes out, but 15 minutes felt like a lifetime when I could hear him trying the front door now, the knob turning easily in his hand. The door didn't open though. By pure luck, I'd thrown the deadbolt after bringing in groceries that afternoon, something I rarely remembered to do. The doorknob stopped rattling, followed by silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then came a sound that turned my insides to water, the scrape of metal on metal. He was working on the lock, and from the purposeful rhythm of the sounds, he knew what he was doing. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, whispering to the dispatcher that he was trying to break in, that I needed to hide. She stayed on the line as I crept to my parents' bedroom, the only room with a lock on the door, my bare feet silent on the old floorboards I'd learned to navigate in darkness as a kid. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the distinctive click of the deadbolt turning. The front door creaked open slowly, and heavy footsteps entered my house. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps moved through the living room with confidence, pausing occasionally like he was examining things. I heard drawers opening in the kitchen, the refrigerator door, then the squeak of the stairs as he began climbing to the second floor. Each step was deliberate, taking his time, and between the footfalls I could hear him breathing, this raspy, excited sound like he'd been running. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, to lock the door, help was coming, but her voice felt distant and useless. The footsteps reached the landing and turned toward my bedroom first. Through the thin door I heard him enter my room, the bed creaking as he sat down, then stood again. He was looking for me, checking the closet, even looking under the bed from the sounds of it. Then his footsteps moved back to the hallway, and I watched the strip of light under the door as his shadow passed by, heading to the bathroom, then the guest room, systematically checking each space. Finally, his shadow stopped directly in front of my parents' bedroom door. The doorknob turned slowly, meeting the resistance of the lock. Silence for a moment, then a soft laugh, not quite normal, more like air being forced through clenched teeth. He knocked, 3 gentle taps like he was visiting a friend. "I saw you watching me," he said, and his voice was worse than I'd imagined, smooth and conversational, with this underlying wheeze like damaged lungs. "That's rude, you know, watching people." Another knock, harder this time. The dispatcher was practically shouting in my ear that units were 2 minutes out, but I couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at that door handle as it jiggled violently. Then everything went quiet again. His shadow moved away from the door and I heard him walk back toward the stairs, but he didn't go down. Instead, he sat on the top step. I knew that particular creak from years of sneaking in after curfew. He was waiting, and somehow that was worse than if he'd kept trying to get in. Sirens finally pierced the night, growing louder as they turned onto the gravel road. The man stood immediately, taking the stairs 3 at a time from the sound of it, his boots thundering through the house. The back door slammed so hard that something fell in the kitchen and shattered. Through the bedroom window, I saw him sprint across the yard, that tall figure moving with surprising speed toward the wheat field. He paused at the property line, turning back to look at the house one more time, as red and blue lights flooded the driveway. Then he disappeared into the wheat, the stalk swallowing him like he'd never existed at all. The police found me 20 minutes later, still locked in that bedroom, still clutching the phone. They searched for hours with dogs and flashlights, but all they found were boot prints in the dirt and 5 cigarette butts arranged in a perfect line beneath my bedroom window, like he'd been there multiple nights, watching, waiting for the right moment. I left that same morning, threw everything in my car while the cops were still processing the scene, stayed with a friend in Bozeman for the rest of the summer and never went back to that farmhouse alone. The police never caught him. They increased patrols in the area for a few weeks, told me he was probably some drifter who'd moved on, but I knew better. 2 months later, my parents sold the property to a developer who turned it into 3 suburban lots. The new houses have security systems, motion lights, cameras, all the things that might have helped me sleep that night. Sometimes I Google the address, looking at the street view of those modern homes where our farmhouse used to stand. The oak tree is gone too, cleared for a swimming pool. But I know if I drove out there at night, if I stood where my bedroom window used to be, I'd still feel him watching from somewhere in the darkness, patient as a spider, waiting for another window, another person to notice him standing in their yard. I just finished grading spelling tests that Thursday afternoon when I first heard the crying. Spring of 2018 in our little Texas town meant wildflowers everywhere and neighbors firing up their grills every weekend. I was living in my grandmother's old house on Willow Creek Drive, a street where mailboxes still had those little red flags, and people actually used them. Teaching 4th grade kept me busy during the week, and at 32, I'd settled into a comfortable rhythm of lesson plans and weekend gardening. The house had been mine for 5 years by then, a 2-bedroom place with creaky floors and a kitchen window that looked directly into the backyard next door. My days followed a predictable pattern. School until 3:30, home to water the tomatoes, maybe a glass of wine on the porch while watching the neighborhood kids race their bikes before dinner. That particular April had been unseasonably warm, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer by noon. Everything about my life felt steady and safe, wrapped in the familiar sounds of lawn mowers and screen doors slamming. The Thompsons had lived next door for as long as anyone could remember, but after old Mr. Thompson passed away from a heart attack, his son Bradley moved in alone. Bradley was 40-something, worked at the hardware store downtown, and kept to himself mostly. He'd wave when he saw you but never stopped to chat like his father used to. The man had this peculiar habit of wearing long-sleeved flannel shirts even when the temperature hit 90 degrees, and his truck always had mud on it despite the fact we hadn't had rain in weeks. He'd installed one of those tall privacy fences between our properties about 6 months after moving in, saying something about wanting to keep his German Shepherd from bothering anyone. Thing is, I never once saw or heard that dog. What really struck me as odd was how he'd completely renovated the old garden shed in his backyard. I could hear power tools running for weeks, sometimes until 2 in the morning. When I asked him about it once while getting my mail, he just said he was turning it into a workshop for woodworking projects, then quickly went inside his house before I could respond. It was a Thursday evening, around 6 o'clock, when I first heard something that made me stop washing dishes and listen. Through my kitchen window, I could see Bradley's shed clearly, painted dark green with a small window covered by what looked like black plastic from the inside. The sound was faint, almost like a wounded animal, but there was something distinctly human about it. I turned off the faucet and stood there, soapy hands dripping, straining to hear better. The crying, because that's what it was, I realized, came in short bursts, muffled and desperate. My first thought was maybe Bradley had hurt himself working with his tools, but his truck wasn't even in the driveway. The sound stopped after a minute or so, and I convinced myself it must have been a cat. We had plenty of strays in the neighborhood, and they could make ungodly noises when they fought or got stuck somewhere. Still, something about the rhythm of those cries stuck with me. I dried my hands and went out to my backyard, pretending to check on my tomato plants while really trying to get a better angle on that shed. The next few days, I found myself listening more carefully whenever I was home. Friday passed without incident, but on Saturday morning, while I was spreading mulch in my flower beds, I heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct, definitely human, definitely distressed. The shed was maybe 30 feet from where I knelt in the dirt, and those sounds were coming from inside it. Bradley's truck was in the driveway this time, and I could see him through his kitchen window, calmly making breakfast like nothing was wrong. The crying turned into what sounded like someone trying to speak through a gag or covering, words I couldn't make out, but desperate in tone. My mouth went completely dry, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. When Bradley suddenly looked up from his stove and stared straight at me through his window, I quickly looked away and focused on my gardening. But my mind was racing. Who keeps someone in a shed? The thought seemed insane, like something from a crime show, not something that happens in real life. Yet those sounds, I spent the rest of the day trying to come up with logical explanations while that sick feeling in my gut grew stronger. Sunday came with thunderstorms, the kind that knock out power and flood the streets within minutes. I figured the rain would mask any sounds from next door, but around midnight, a lightning flash lit up my bedroom and I saw Bradley out there in the downpour, carrying something wrapped in a tarp toward his shed. He moved quickly despite the mud, and the way he kept checking around made my chest tighten with anxiety. I pressed myself against my bedroom wall, peering through the edge of my curtain as he unlocked what looked like 3 different padlocks on the shed door. The whole thing took maybe 2 minutes, but watching him struggle with whatever was in that tarp, something heavy by the way he had to readjust his grip twice, made me realize this wasn't normal workshop behavior. After he went back inside his house, I sat on my bed for hours, listening to the rain and trying to talk myself out of what I was thinking. But then, between thunder rolls, I heard it again, louder this time, more desperate. Someone was screaming behind that shed door, screaming words I could barely make out. Please, and what sounded like home. My whole body turned cold, and I knew right then I wasn't imagining this. Monday morning, I called in sick to work, something I never did unless I was genuinely ill. But I couldn't leave, not when every instinct told me someone needed help next door. I positioned myself at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a clear view of Bradley's backyard, pretending to grade papers while really watching that shed. Around 10, after Bradley left for work, I did something that still makes me feel guilty and brave at the same time. I walked over to his fence and tried to peek through the gaps between the boards. The shed had no windows on the side facing my yard, just that one covered window facing Bradley's house. I could hear movement inside, shuffling sounds and what might have been chains dragging across wood. Then, clear as day, I heard a young voice, couldn't tell if it was male or female, saying, "Is someone there? Help me. Please help me." My knees nearly buckled. This was real. This was happening. and someone was being held prisoner 15 feet from where I ate breakfast every morning. I backed away from the fence, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, and ran inside to grab my phone. The 911 call was probably the most difficult phone conversation I've ever had. How do you explain that you think your neighbor is keeping someone locked in a shed without sounding like a paranoid lunatic? The dispatcher, a woman with a steady voice, kept asking me to slow down and repeat myself. I told her about the crying, the screaming, the voice begging for help just minutes ago. She asked if I could see anyone in immediate danger, and I had to admit I couldn't actually see inside the shed. There was a long pause before she said she'd send an officer to do a welfare check. 20 minutes later, a single patrol car pulled up. No sirens, no urgency, just Officer Garrett, a young cop who looked barely out of the academy. He listened to my story with a skeptical expression, took some notes, then walked over to Bradley's house and knocked. No answer, of course, since Bradley was at work. Garrett walked around the property from the sidewalk, shone his flashlight at the shed from a distance, then came back to tell me there was no probable cause to enter private property. He suggested I call back if I heard anything else concerning and gave me his card. I watched him drive away, feeling completely helpless and frustrated. That afternoon, I did something I'm not proud of but felt was necessary. I called Bradley's work and pretended to be interested in buying lumber, asking specifically when Bradley would be available to help me. They said he was there until 5. That gave me about 3 hours. I grabbed the biggest hammer from my garage and walked straight to his backyard. To hell with trespassing laws when someone's life might be at stake. The shed door had 3 heavy-duty padlocks, just as I'd seen, but the window on the side was my target. I smashed through the black plastic and glass with one swing, then used the hammer's claw to tear away the boards Bradley had nailed over it from the inside. The smell that hit me was awful. Human waste, sweat, and something rotten like old food. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, I saw her, a girl, maybe 16 or 17, chained to a metal post Bradley had installed in the concrete floor. She was wearing a dirty t-shirt and shorts, her hair matted, her eyes wide with terror and hope. She tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper, "Water, please." I told her I was getting her out right now, then called 911 again, this time screaming at them to send everyone, send them now. There's a kidnapped girl in the shed at 427 Willow Creek Drive. Everything happened fast after that. I stayed with the girl, talking to her through the window while sirens grew louder in the distance. Her name was Ashley, and she'd run away from a foster home in Oklahoma 3 weeks ago. Bradley had offered her a ride at a truck stop, said he knew a place she could stay for a few nights, get a meal and figure things out. She'd been in that shed for 18 days. 18 days of him bringing her water and gas station food twice a day, telling her that nobody was looking for her, that foster kids disappeared all the time and no one cared. She showed me the bucket in the corner, the thin mattress on the floor, the notebook where she'd been scratching marks to count the days. When the police arrived, 3 cars, then 5, then the whole street was flashing red and blue. They had to use bolt cutters on the chains. The EMTs wrapped Ashley in one of those silver emergency blankets, and she grabbed my hand before they put her in the ambulance, squeezing it so tight I could feel every bone. "You saved my life," she whispered, and I just nodded because I couldn't speak through the tears. The image of her being wheeled away on that stretcher, finally safe, is something I'll never forget. Bradley arrived home from work right as they were putting up crime scene tape around his property. I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw the police cars, the ambulance, the shed door hanging open with investigators taking photographs inside. He didn't run or fight. He just stood there by his truck, shoulders sagging like he knew it was over. They arrested him right there on his driveway while half the neighborhood watched from their yards. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me and his expression wasn't angry or threatening. It was almost relieved, like he was tired of carrying the weight of what he'd done. The detective told me later that Bradley confessed to everything during questioning. He'd been planning it for months, specifically targeting runaways because he thought no one would miss them. The soundproofing he'd installed wasn't perfect, but it would have been good enough if I hadn't been paying attention. They found receipts for the materials, internet searches about missing teenagers, even a journal where he'd written about his plans. The shed had been designed as a prison from the start. The concrete floor poured specially to hold that metal post, ventilation holes drilled to keep someone alive but not comfortable, the door reinforced from the inside. The investigation revealed that Ashley wasn't supposed to be his first victim. Police found evidence that Bradley had been watching and documenting patterns of other runaways at various truck stops across Texas for over a year. He had photographs, license plates of people who gave them rides, notes about which days had the most vulnerable kids passing through. Ashley just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time when Bradley felt ready to execute his plan. What haunts me most is that he told investigators he chose our neighborhood specifically because it was quiet, full of people who minded their own business, and his father's reputation would protect him from suspicion. He was right about almost everything, except he didn't count on me being a teacher, trained to notice when something's wrong with a young person, even when I couldn't see them. The prosecutors said my 911 calls, especially the second one, saved Ashley's life. Bradley had been growing frustrated with her resistance, and his journal entries from those final days suggested he was considering ending the situation soon. Those were his actual words, like she was a problem to solve instead of a human being. Ashley recovered physically within a few months, though I know the emotional scars will last much longer. She sent me a letter 6 months later from her new placement, a group home in Colorado that specializes in helping trafficked and abused teens. She said she was learning to trust again, taking online classes to catch up on school, and had adopted a rescue cat named Warrior. We still exchange Christmas cards, and last year she sent me a photo from her high school graduation. Bradley got 40 years in federal prison for kidnapping and false imprisonment, though he'll be eligible for parole in 25. I moved out of that house 2 months after it happened, not because I was scared, but because I couldn't stop staring at that empty shed, couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd called the police after the very first time I heard crying. The new owners tore it down immediately, planted a garden where it used to stand. Sometimes I drive by the old neighborhood, and it looks exactly the same as before, peaceful and quiet. But I know better now. I pay attention to things others might dismiss, trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. And I'll never again assume that terrible things can't happen just because the street looks safe and the neighbors wave hello. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over small Nebraska neighborhoods at night. The kind where you can hear a dog barking 3 blocks away, or a garage door opening down the street. I'd been living in this house about 20 minutes outside Lincoln for 8 months, working from home as a freelance graphic designer, spending my days in the front office watching the predictable rhythm of suburban life through my window. The mailman at noon, kids getting off the school bus at 3:30, sprinklers turning on at dusk. Everything had its schedule, its pattern, its comfortable predictability. The house next door belonged to Walter Hutchinson, a man probably in his late 60s who existed more as a ghost than an actual neighbor. During my entire time living there, I'd spotted him maybe 3 times total, always at dawn when he'd shuffle out to check his mail wearing this faded blue windbreaker with reflective strips that caught the streetlight just before sunrise. He moved like someone who didn't want to be noticed, quick and purposeful, never making eye contact or acknowledging anyone's existence. It was mid-February when I first noticed Walter's basement light clicking on in the middle of the night. My bedroom window faced his house, and around 2 or 3 a.m. this harsh fluorescent glow would suddenly flood through my blinds, bright enough to wake me from deep sleep. Initially, I didn't think much of it. Insomnia hits everyone differently, and maybe the old guy liked to tinker with projects when he couldn't sleep. But after a couple of weeks, something started bothering me about the whole situation. Walter's beat-up Ford truck hadn't moved from his driveway in what seemed like forever. Dead leaves had accumulated in thick drifts around the tires, and the windshield was covered in that yellowish-green pollen that comes with early spring. His lawn had transformed into a jungle, the grass reaching almost knee-height, full of dandelions and wild growth that would have driven any self-respecting homeowner crazy. The mailbox was stuffed to capacity, with catalogs and envelopes scattered on the ground beneath it, like nobody had touched them in weeks. What really got under my skin was the randomness of it all. Some nights the light would stay on for 4, maybe 5 hours straight, and I'd drift in and out of sleep with that glow bleeding through my window. Other nights, it would flicker on for just 10 or 15 minutes before plunging back into darkness. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, jotting down the times just to see if there was any logic to it. 2:47 a.m. on Monday, 3:15 a.m. on Tuesday, nothing Wednesday, then 1:23 a.m. on Friday. No pattern whatsoever. The strangest part was that I never saw any other lights in the house. Not the kitchen, not the living room, not even the porch light when he'd supposedly be going down to the basement. Just that single rectangular window glowing like some kind of beacon in the night, casting long shadows across his overgrown yard. By the third week of this, I couldn't ignore how wrong everything felt. Walter's house looked abandoned in every way except for that basement light. Spiderwebs had formed across his front door, thick and undisturbed. A package from Amazon had been sitting on his porch for at least 10 days. The cardboard warped from rain and sun. Even his garbage bins hadn't been moved to the curb in over a month. I knew because I'd been paying attention, watching from my office window during the day, trying to catch any sign of life. The neighbors on the other side, the Johnsons, mentioned they hadn't seen Walter either when I casually brought it up while getting my mail, but nobody seemed particularly concerned. "He's always been odd," Mrs. Johnson said, shrugging like this was just Walter being Walter. "Keeps to himself, you know how some people are." That Friday night I decided I'd had enough of the mystery. The light had been on since midnight, and by 2 a.m. I was wide awake, staring at that glowing window from my bedroom. I threw on a hoodie and my old sneakers, the ones that didn't squeak, and stepped out into the cold February air. The neighborhood was dead quiet, except for the distant hum of the interstate a few miles away. Walter's yard felt like stepping into a different world. The grass was so tall it soaked my jeans up to the knees with dew, and I had to push through it like I was wading through water. The closer I got to his house, the louder my heartbeat seemed, thundering in my ears. I wasn't planning anything illegal, I told myself. Just wanted to peek through the basement window, maybe see what was causing that light. The window sat at ground level, one of those narrow rectangular ones that most basements have, and it was cracked open about an inch, letting out a thin line of bright white light and the faint sound of something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe a fan or some kind of machinery. I crouched down next to the window, my knees sinking into the wet earth, and tried to angle myself to see inside without being too obvious. The glass was dirty, covered in spots of mud and dust, but through the grime I could make out part of the basement. What I saw made my whole body go rigid. The walls were covered, absolutely covered, in photographs. Not family photos or artistic shots, but what looked like surveillance photos. People walking, sitting in cars, entering buildings, all taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. They were pinned up with red thumbtacks in neat rows, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some had writing underneath in black marker that I couldn't read from my angle, but what made my throat close up was recognizing some of the faces. There was Janet from the coffee shop downtown, the one who always remembered my order. There was Mr. Castellano, who taught at the local high school. There was even a photo of the teenage kid who delivered newspapers on Sunday mornings. My legs were trembling as I shifted position to get a better view, and that's when I saw the far wall, the one with the larger prints. These weren't just random surveillance shots. These were photos of people who'd been in the news recently, their faces familiar from missing person posters I'd seen around town. And on social media, Amanda Reeves, the college student who'd vanished from the university campus 3 months ago. Douglas Harper, the accountant whose car was found abandoned by the river in January. Sophia Mendez, the nurse who never showed up for her shift at the medical center and hadn't been seen since. Their photos were arranged in a timeline, with dates written underneath, some dating back years. Below each missing person's photo was a series of other shots, them at grocery stores, walking their dogs, sitting in their cars at red lights. The level of documentation was insane, like Walter had been tracking these people for weeks or months before they disappeared. In the corner of the basement, I could see what looked like file boxes, dozens of them, labeled with years going back to at least 2010. The sound of a door creaking from inside the house sent a jolt of pure panic through me. I dropped flat against the wet ground, my cheek pressed into the mud, not daring to breathe. Through the thin crack of the window, I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the basement floor. Then a voice, Walter's voice, but different from the few times I'd heard him speak before. He was talking to someone, his tone conversational, almost cheerful. "You're being so quiet tonight," he said. And there was something deeply wrong about the way he said it, like he was talking to a child or a pet. "That's okay. We have plenty of time. No one even knows you're here." The footsteps moved closer to the window, and I could see a shadow pass by. I pressed myself flatter against the ground, praying the tall grass would hide me. My phone was in my pocket, and I slowly reached for it, trying not to make any movement that might catch his attention through that cracked window. Just as my fingers wrapped around my phone, Walter's footsteps stopped directly above me, on the other side of the window. I could hear his breathing, raspy and uneven, like he'd been smoking for decades. "Did you hear that?" he said to whoever was in there with him. "Sounds like we might have a visitor." My entire body locked up, muscles so tense they hurt. Through the tiny gap, I could see his feet in worn brown slippers standing maybe 2 feet from the window. He stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, then walked away, his voice getting fainter. No, probably just a raccoon. They've been getting into everything since nobody's been cutting this grass." I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, then slowly, painfully slowly, started crawling backward through the grass. Every movement felt like it took forever, every rustle of the grass sounding like an explosion in the quiet night. I made it back to the property line, then to my yard, my clothes soaked and covered in mud. Once inside my house, I locked every door, checked every window, and called 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher sounded skeptical at first. A concerned neighbor reporting suspicious activity isn't exactly high priority. But when I mentioned the missing person's photos, Amanda Reeves specifically, her tone changed completely. "Officers are on their way. Stay in your home and keep your doors locked." Within 15 minutes, the street was flooded with police cars. No sirens, but lights flashing, reflecting off every house on the block. I watched from my window as they surrounded Walter's house, and then heard them through a megaphone asking him to come out. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then they broke down the door. The shouting that followed was intense but brief, and I saw them bring Walter out in handcuffs, his blue windbreaker still on, his face completely calm like he'd been expecting this. He looked directly at my window as they put him in the patrol car, and the expression on his face wasn't anger. It was disappointment, like I'd ruined something he'd been working on for a very long time. The next few hours were a blur of police interviews and evidence collection. They found Amanda Reeves in a soundproofed room Walter had built in a corner of the basement, behind a false wall. She was alive, dehydrated and traumatized, but alive, and had been there for 6 days. The other missing people weren't as fortunate. The police found remains buried in various locations throughout the county, based on detailed maps Walter had kept in those file boxes. Turned out he'd been doing this for 13 years, selecting people who fit specific criteria he'd written out in notebooks they recovered. He worked as a night security guard at a warehouse for decades before retiring, a job that taught him about surveillance, about watching, about patience. The photos on his wall represented years of stalking, and the police counted at least 47 victims, though they suspected there were more. Walter had been using his basement as what investigators called a collection point, keeping victims there, before moving them to secondary locations. They never let me see the full extent of what they found in that house, but the detective who interviewed me said I'd saved Amanda's life and potentially prevented more disappearances. Walter Hutchinson pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and got multiple life sentences without parole. The house next door was eventually demolished after sitting empty for a year, and now there's just an empty lot there that nobody wants to build on. Sometimes at night, I still wake up around 2 or 3 a.m., and I find myself looking out the window at where that basement window used to be. The neighborhood returned to its quiet routine: mailman at noon, kids off the bus at 3:30, sprinklers at dusk. But I can't forget Walter's voice that night, talking to Amanda in the basement, or the way he looked at me as they drove him away. I've thought about moving, but somehow staying feels like bearing witness to what happened here, making sure people remember. Because the scariest part wasn't discovering what Walter was doing. It was realizing he'd been doing it for over a decade, while we all lived our normal lives right next door, never suspecting that our boring, quiet neighborhood was hiding something so evil. The Ford Ranger's engine knocked like it always did when I pushed past 50. Reminding me why Frank kept nagging me to let him rebuild it at the shop. Route 19 stretched ahead through Millbrook's outskirts, nothing but darkness and the occasional reflective postmarking where the asphalt met the drainage ditch. I'd just finished wrestling with Mrs. Crawford's Buick transmission for the past 6 hours, grease still caked under my fingernails, despite scrubbing them raw with that orange pumice soap. The radio crackled with static between stations. You could never get decent reception once you passed the Dawson farm. November nights in West Virginia had a particular weight to them, cold seeping through the truck's worn weather stripping, making me crank the heater that only worked on the highest setting. My phone showed 11:07 p.m. on the cracked screen, and I was already planning which leftover to heat up first when the lights hit my mirrors. Red and blue, alternating in that pattern that makes your chest tighten even when you know you've done nothing wrong. The cruiser appeared out of nowhere. I hadn't seen headlights behind me for the last 10 miles. I eased off the gas and pulled onto the narrow shoulder where the field met the road, dry corn stubble on one side and thick woods on the other. Through the side mirror, I watched the Crown Victoria settle in behind me, its engine idling rough, probably one of those old Interceptors the county bought at auction and never properly maintained. The spotlight snapped on, flooding everything in surgical white brightness that turned my cab into a fishbowl. I killed the engine and rolled down my window, cold air rushing in along with the sound of boots on gravel approaching from behind. The deputy who appeared at my window wasn't anyone I recognized, which was strange in a place where you knew every cop by their coffee order. He had one of those faces that seemed assembled from mismatched parts. Nose too sharp, jaw too wide, eyes set deep enough that the spotlight's glare couldn't reach them. His uniform looked regulation except for how it hung on him, like it belonged to someone else, someone bigger. The nameplate read Deputy Carlisle, but the letters seemed worn, hard to make out. He leaned down, bringing with him the smell of cigarettes and something else, something chemical like antifreeze or formaldehyde. His flashlight beam hit my face, then swept through the cab's interior, lingering on my toolbox in the passenger footwell. The work invoices scattered on the dash, finally settling on my hands, gripping the steering wheel. "License and registration," he said, but his voice had this quality to it like he was reading lines he'd memorized but didn't quite understand. I reached for my wallet, moving slow and deliberate the way my dad taught me, announcing each movement. The deputy watched my hands with an intensity that made the hair on my neck prickle. When I handed over my documents, his fingers were ice cold despite the thick gloves he wore, and he held my license up to his flashlight for what felt like a full minute, studying it like he was memorizing every detail. "Your taillight's out," he finally said, still staring at my ID. "Going to need you to step out of the vehicle so we can take a look at it together." The way he said "together" made my mouth go dry. I knew for a fact both taillights were working, I'd checked them myself that morning when I'd done the routine maintenance on the truck. Frank was particular about his employees maintaining their vehicles, said it was bad advertising for a mechanic to drive around with broken lights or squealing brakes. "Deputy, I'm sure they're both working fine," I said, keeping my voice level despite the crawling sensation working its way up my spine. "I can show you from here if you'd like." He tapped my license against the window frame, a rhythmic sound that seemed too loud in the quiet night. Each tap left a small mark on the glass, and I noticed his wedding ring was on the wrong hand, worn on his right ring finger instead of the left. "Need you to step out," he repeated, and this time his free hand moved to rest on his service weapon. Not threatening exactly, but deliberate enough to make the message clear. The woods beside us were silent. No insects, no wind through the trees, like everything was holding its breath. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly, and that's when I saw it in the side mirror. There was someone else in the cruiser's passenger seat. Just a shadow, really. But definitely there, not moving, just watching. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out, and immediately Deputy Carlisle positioned himself between me and my truck door, close enough that I could see the stubble on his neck was growing in strange patches, like a bad skin graft. "Walk to the back," he instructed, gesturing with his flashlight toward my truck bed. As we moved, I noticed the cruiser's license plate was covered in mud, deliberately it seemed, and the unit number on the side was partially scraped off. We stopped at the tailgate, and I could clearly see both lights glowing red in the reflection off the cruiser's hood. "See, Deputy? They're both working." He stood there for a moment, flashlight beam dancing between the perfectly functional taillights, then turned to me with this expression that wasn't quite a smile. "No, that one's definitely out," he said, pointing to the left light that was clearly illuminated. "You need to come sit in my vehicle while I write this up. Department policy for safety violations." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but where would I go? Miles of empty road in either direction, thick woods on both sides, and this deputy with his hand still casual on his weapon. "I'd rather wait by my truck if that's all right," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let me just call my roommate to let him know I'll be late." The screen wouldn't turn on, completely dead even though it had been at 40% when I left the shop. Carlisle noticed and made this sound in his throat, not quite a laugh. "No need for calls. This'll just take a minute." He stepped closer, and I could smell that chemical odor again, stronger now, making my eyes water. "Protocol says you need to sit in the cruiser. Don't make this difficult." Behind him, that shadow in his passenger seat shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of what looked like hair, long and tangled, pressed against the window. "I know my rights," I said, taking a step backward toward my truck. "I don't have to sit in your vehicle for a traffic citation." Something changed in his posture then, a stillness that reminded me of a snake before it strikes. He pulled his radio from his belt, but when he pressed the button, no static came through. No dispatcher response. The thing wasn't even turned on. "Unit 12 requesting backup at mile marker 37, he said into the dead radio, his eyes never leaving mine. Driver being non-compliant. He clipped it back to his belt like he'd actually spoken to someone, then said in this flat, emotionless voice, "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time. Get in the cruiser." The spotlight from his car suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness except for his flashlight beam. And in that moment of adjustment, I heard car doors opening. Not just his, but multiple doors, like there were more vehicles I couldn't see. I didn't wait to find out who or what was coming out of those cars. I bolted toward my truck, yanking the door handle just as Carlisle's hand grabbed my shoulder. His grip was impossibly strong, fingers digging in through my jacket, but I twisted hard and felt the fabric tear as I pulled free. I threw myself into the cab, slamming the locks just as his flashlight smashed against the window, leaving a spiderweb crack. The engine turned over on the third try while fists pounded on the glass. And not just Carlisle's, I could see other shapes in my peripheral vision, surrounding the truck. One face pressed against the passenger window, mouth moving like it was trying to speak, but the features were all wrong. skin too loose like a mask that didn't fit right. I threw it in drive and floored it, gravel spraying as the truck lurched forward, and in the rear view I saw at least 3 figures standing in the road, all wearing what looked like sheriff's department uniforms, all watching me drive away without pursuing. I didn't slow down until I hit the Millbrook city limits, pulling into the 24-hour gas station with my whole body trembling, adrenaline making everything too bright and sharp. The attendant, a kid named Jerome who I'd gone to high school with, took one look at me and asked if I needed him to call someone. I almost said yes, call the police, but then stopped. What would I say? A deputy tried to get me in his car? I asked Jerome if he knew a Deputy Carlisle, and he gave me this confused look. There's only 4 deputies in the whole county, man. Robinson, Vance, Harrell, and that new lady Simmons. No Carlisle. My torn jacket and the cracked window were the only proof I had that anything had happened. Jerome let me use the station phone to call Frank, told him I'd had car trouble and wouldn't make it in tomorrow. Then I sat in that fluorescent-lit gas station until dawn, drinking coffee that tasted like burnt water, watching every car that passed. The next few days I kept my mouth shut, went to work, stayed in town after dark. But I started asking careful questions, casual-like, while changing oil or rotating tires. That's when the stories started surfacing. Old Mrs. Henley mentioned her nephew from 2 towns over who'd gone missing on Route 19 6 months back. Car found abandoned with the driver door open. Jerome's cousin had a friend who swore he'd been pulled over by a deputy that didn't exist, barely got away when 2 other cruisers appeared out of nowhere. The more I dug, the more I found. Always Route 19, always between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., always someone traveling alone. The real sheriff's department, when I finally worked up the nerve to check, had no record of any traffic stops at mile marker 37 that night. They suggested I might have encountered someone impersonating an officer, took a report, said they'd investigate, but I could tell from their faces they'd heard this before, and nothing ever came of it. I left Millbrook 2 weeks later, packed everything I could fit in that Ford Ranger with its cracked window, and drove straight through to Ohio without stopping. Found another mechanic job, another small town, but one with more people and better cell service. Frank understood, didn't even make me work out my notice. Before I left, Jerome pulled me aside at the gas station and handed me a folder. Inside were newspaper clippings he'd been collecting, going back 3 years. Missing persons reports, abandoned vehicles, all connected to that stretch of Route 19. The last clipping was from just 2 days after my encounter. A traveling salesman from Maryland, last seen heading through Millbrook around midnight. His car was found the next morning at mile marker 37. Driver door open, both taillights working perfectly. They never found him, just like the others. I still check the West Virginia news sometimes, looking for updates, but deep down I know the truth. Whatever's happening on Route 19, it's still happening. And the real horror is that someone, somewhere, knows exactly what it is. "6 months working as head librarian at the public library in Rosewood, Georgia had taught me the rhythm of small-town life. Everybody knows everybody here, the kind of place where the biggest scandal is usually who forgot to return their library books on time. The library itself is this beautiful old brick building from the 1920s, with tall windows that let in streams of dusty light and wooden floors that creak with every step. Most days, I'd spend my time helping high school kids with research papers, or chatting with the elderly regulars who came in for the air conditioning and romance novels. Mrs. Eloise would bring me tomatoes from her garden, and old Mr. Hutchins would fall asleep in the biography section every Friday afternoon like clockwork. It was peaceful, predictable, exactly what I needed after the chaos of Atlanta. The town had maybe 3,000 people, 2 traffic lights, and 1 main street where everyone did their shopping. The city council had finally approved renovations for the library's basement after years of water damage complaints. We needed to clear out decades of accumulated junk before the contractors could start work the following Monday. I volunteered to handle it myself because I wanted to catalog everything properly. There could be town history down there worth preserving. The basement was this maze of metal shelving units packed with donation boxes nobody had touched since the 80s, old equipment covered in dust sheets, and stacks of yellowing newspapers tied with twine. The air was thick with that musty smell of old paper and mildew. Behind a wall of moldy encyclopedias that practically disintegrated when I moved them, I found 3 cardboard boxes sealed with heavy-duty packing tape that had turned yellow and brittle with age. Someone had written "Property of Rosewood PD, do not destroy" across the top in faded black marker. My curiosity got the better of me. The tape practically crumbled when I cut through it with my box cutter. Inside the first box were manila folders, dozens of them, each one containing what looked like missing person reports. The paper was that old government-issue beige color, typewritten with actual typewriter keys that left indentations you could feel with your fingers. Names, dates, photographs paperclipped to the corners. People who had vanished from Rosewood going back to the 1960s. What caught my attention wasn't just the number of files, but how each one was stamped "closed" in red ink, with no resolution notes, no follow-up reports, nothing to indicate what happened to these people. Just name after name. Louise Carpenter, age 23, disappeared May 1967. Robert Nguyen, age 45, disappeared October 1973. Teenage kids, middle-aged parents, elderly folks, no pattern to the ages or backgrounds. The second and third boxes contained more of the same. By my count, there were 78 missing person cases, all from Rosewood and the surrounding county, all marked closed without any explanation. The most recent file was from 2008, a woman named Maria Vasquez who worked at the local grocery store. I actually remembered when she supposedly moved away suddenly to care for a sick relative in California. That's what everyone said anyway. But here was her file, reported missing by her landlord when she didn't pay rent. Her car found abandoned on Route 42. The responding officer's notes mentioned blood on the driver's seat, but the case was closed 2 days later with no further investigation documented. I spent the next 3 hours photographing every single page with my phone. The battery died twice, and I had to run upstairs to charge it at my desk, terrified someone would come down and find me with these files. My mind kept racing. How could a town this small have so many missing people without anyone talking about it? We had a weekly newspaper, town meetings, gossipy neighbors who knew when you changed your curtains. But 78 people gone, and nobody ever mentioned it. The dates were spread out enough, maybe 3 or 4 per year, that perhaps people just forgot, moved on, accepted whatever story they were told. But seeing them all together like this, documented in black and white, made my chest tight with anxiety. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about those files. I made the mistake of going to see Chief Coleman at the police station. He'd always been friendly when I'd seen him around town. Mid-50s, coached Little League. The type who'd help you change a flat tire. The station was just a small building next to the post office. Only 4 officers total for the whole town. When I told him about the boxes, showed him a few photos on my phone, his whole demeanor changed. His jaw clenched, and he leaned back in his chair, studying me with this calculating look I'd never seen before. "Those records are sealed for a reason," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Some things are better left buried. Delete those photos, return the boxes to where you found them, and forget you ever saw them, for your own good." The way he said it wasn't threatening exactly, but it made every hair on my arm stand up. I didn't delete the photos. Instead, I went home to my little rental house on Sycamore Lane and uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services. Then I started researching the names from the files. Most led to dead ends. No social media, no obituaries, no mentions in other towns. But a few had family members still looking for them. I found a Facebook group called Missing Voices of North Georgia, where a woman named Beverly was still posting about her sister Louise Carpenter every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. The same Louise from the 1967 file. Beverly lived just 2 hours away in Marietta. I sent her a private message, attached the photos of her sister's file, and asked if she wanted to meet. She responded within minutes. "How did you get this? I've been trying to get information from Rosewood PD for 40 years. That's when the black SUV appeared. The first night, Wednesday, I noticed it parked across from my house around 10 p.m. when I was closing the living room curtains. Government plates, tinted windows so dark you couldn't see inside. It was still there when I checked at midnight, at 3 a.m. when I got up for water, and gone by sunrise. Thursday night, same thing, except this time it was parked one house down. By Friday, it was right in front of my mailbox. I tried taking a photo of the license plate, but they'd covered it with mud. Deliberately, just enough to obscure the numbers, but not enough to look suspicious to anyone passing by. I knew they wanted me to see them, to know I was being watched. The message was clear without anyone saying a word. Saturday morning, I met Beverly at a diner in Dahlonega, halfway between Rosewood and Marietta. She was in her 70s, thin and sharp-eyed, carrying a worn folder full of her own research about Louise. Her hands trembled when she saw the police file photos on my phone. "They told us she ran off with some boy," she whispered, voice cracking. "Said she'd been seeing someone secretly. My parents believed them, but I knew Louise. She was planning to start nursing school that fall, had already bought her textbooks. Beverly showed me letters she'd written to the FBI, the state police, even the governor's office over the years. Every single one had been redirected back to Rosewood PD, who always gave the same response. Case closed, no evidence of foul play. She told me about other families she'd connected with over the years, all with missing relatives from the Rosewood area, all given similar excuses. What Beverly said next made my mouth go dry. Her nephew was a state trooper, and he'd done some unofficial digging for her about 5 years earlier. He'd found property records showing that the Rosewood Police Department owned 16 acres of undeveloped land about 8 miles outside town, purchased in 1962. The land had no buildings, no stated purpose, just thick woods and a single dirt access road. But satellite images from Google Earth showed regular tire tracks leading in and out, and what looked like disturbed earth in several areas, patches where the vegetation grew differently. When he tried to access the property to investigate further, he was pulled over by Chief Coleman himself and told his career would be over if he ever came back to Rosewood. He'd transferred to a different county the next week and refused to talk about it anymore, even to Beverly. I gave Beverly copies of all the files I'd photographed. We agreed she'd share them with the other families, while I tried to find a journalist who might investigate. But when I got home that afternoon, my front door was standing wide open. Nothing was stolen, nothing destroyed, but everything had been touched. Every book on my shelves was pulled out exactly 1 inch. Every picture frame was turned to face the wall. My kitchen drawers were all open precisely halfway. Even my bed sheets were folded down in a perfect triangle, like in a hotel. The precision of it was worse than if they'd ransacked the place. They wanted me to know they'd been through everything, that they could enter whenever they wanted. I found my laptop in the refrigerator, still running, with a sticky note on the screen that just said, "Stop." My phone, which I'd left charging in the bedroom, was now in the bathroom sink, displaying a photo I hadn't taken. A picture of me at the diner with Beverly, shot from a distance through the window. That night I packed everything important and drove to my cousin's house in Tennessee. I didn't tell anyone in Rosewood I was leaving, just never showed up to work Monday morning. I later heard they said I had a family emergency, then that I'd had a nervous breakdown, and eventually that I'd taken a job elsewhere. The same kind of stories they'd probably told about those 78 missing people. I sent all the files to 3 different news outlets and the FBI field office in Atlanta, but nothing ever came of it. Beverly called me once to say 2 other families had received visits from Rosewood police, warning them about spreading false information. She was scared but determined to keep fighting. I still check the news for Rosewood sometimes, waiting for the story to break, for someone to investigate that 16 acres of woods. But small towns keep their secrets, and sometimes the people sworn to protect and serve are the ones making sure those secrets stay buried. My name's Aaron, and a few years ago I worked the overnight shift at the only 24-hour gas station in our town in Kentucky. The pay wasn't great, but it gave me enough to cover rent on my little duplex and keep food in the fridge. Nights there had their own rhythm. Truckers topping off their rigs, regulars grabbing cigarettes, and the occasional drifter passing through. I got used to the hum of the soda machine, the buzzing neon sign that never stayed fully lit, and the kind of silence that settled between customers when the hours stretched too long. One night started out the same as any other. I stocked the cooler, swept the floors, and leaned against the counter scrolling on my phone whenever things slowed down. Around midnight, I noticed an older sedan pulling into the lot. The headlights washed over the windows before it circled once and rolled back onto the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. People miss the entrance all the time, or they realize they're low on cash and drive off. But then, maybe 20 minutes later, the same car came through again, looping around slow enough that I could make out its dented bumper and one dim headlight. By the third time that car came back, creeping around the pumps without stopping, I felt a knot forming in my chest. No one got out. No one rolled a window down. Just that same slow lap, tires crunching over gravel, before disappearing again into the night. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was someone lost, or maybe waiting for someone else. But the longer the hours dragged on, the harder it was to ignore the way my stomach tightened every time I thought I saw headlights in the distance. Around 4 in the morning, my shift was ending, and I went about locking up. That's when I spotted it. Down the street past the edge of the lot, the same sedan sat parked on the shoulder. Its headlights were off, but I could still recognize the shape, the dent in the hood, the dull shine of its paint under the street lamp. I stood with the keys in my hand, pretending to fumble with the lock longer than I needed to, just to keep from turning my back completely. It didn't move. No door opened. It just sat there, like it was waiting for me to leave first. I finally made it to my car, trying not to glance too obviously in the direction of the sedan. The air felt heavy, the kind of quiet that made every sound sharper. My keys jingling, the slam of my door, the click of my seatbelt. When I pulled onto the road, I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. For the first couple of blocks, nothing happened. Then, just as I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, headlights flickered on behind me. The same car, same dented bumper. It eased onto the road, trailing me at a steady distance. My heart pounded so loud it almost drowned out the hum of my engine. I didn't want to drive straight home, so I made a few random turns through the quiet streets, circling blocks I didn't normally take. The car followed each one, never speeding up, never backing off. It was like they knew I was testing them and were content to let me know they weren't going anywhere. After 10 minutes of this, I pulled into a brightly lit parking lot near an all-night diner and just sat there, pretending to dig through my bag. The sedan slowed as it passed but didn't turn in. It kept going, disappearing down the next street. When I finally got home, it was already past 5. I barely slept, every little sound outside pulling me back awake. The next morning, I thought maybe I'd worked myself up over nothing, that whoever it was had just been messing around or drunk. But when I showed up for my next shift, one of the officers from the local police department came into the store. He leaned on the counter, asked if I'd seen a certain car the night before, and described it down to the dent in the hood. My throat went dry. I told him everything, how it circled 3 times, then sat parked down the street. The officer nodded like he wasn't surprised. He said they'd found the car abandoned near the edge of town, doors unlocked. Inside, there were rolls of duct tape, a pack of zip ties, and a pair of gloves shoved into the glove box. He didn't say much else, just told me to be careful walking to my car and to call if I noticed anything strange again. I stood behind that counter long after he left, staring at the pumps in the empty lot beyond, trying to wrap my head around how close I might have come to being someone's target that night. The rest of that week felt unreal. Every time headlights appeared in the distance, I caught myself holding my breath. Customers came and went like always, but I couldn't shake the image of that car sitting in the dark, waiting. Even walking through the aisles of the gas station gave me a strange awareness. How isolated the place really was after midnight. How long it would take anyone to notice if something happened to me. I stopped wearing headphones, stopped stepping outside to smoke on breaks. I kept every door locked and the phone close at hand. A couple of nights later, another officer came by and asked if anyone had approached me in the parking lot. I said no, and he explained that the vehicle had been reported stolen. They never found the person who had been driving it. That detail rattled me worse than anything else. The thought that someone out there, someone who had circled me over and over, was still walking around free made it hard to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. Every face that came into the store became a question mark I couldn't answer. After that, I changed routines. I started parking my car right under the brightest light in the lot and asked a coworker to stay on the phone with me until I was safely inside. For weeks, I couldn't stop running through possibilities in my head. Was it a robbery that never happened? Something worse? Did they just get spooked when they realized the police were nearby? None of it added up, and not knowing became its own kind of weight I carried into every shift. People in town whispered about it for a while, but eventually, like most things, the talk faded. I never saw that sedan again, but I also never worked another overnight alone. To this day, when someone asks why I quit the gas station, I don't say much. I just tell them the truth in the simplest way I can. Once you've had someone circle you like prey, and then find out what they had waiting in the car, you stop pretending those long, quiet nights are harmless. You start seeing the dark for what it really is, a cover for people you'd rather never meet. The town where I grew up didn't have much going on besides a strip mall, a football field, and that abandoned hospital on the edge of the old industrial district. Everyone had their own stories about it, but most were just recycled rumors, flickering lights in the windows, strange noises after dark, someone swearing they saw a figure in a white gown through the third-floor glass. By senior year, people treated it more like a rite of passage than anything else. Sneak in, take a few pictures, maybe record a video, and prove you weren't scared of a crumbling building. That autumn weekend, a couple of friends and I thought it'd be fun to head inside and get some footage for a short video. I was more into filming than they were, so I brought along my camera. The hospital loomed over the street, 4 stories of shattered windows and vines crawling up the brick. Even in daylight, it had this heavy presence, like the walls themselves were holding back secrets no one should uncover. My friends joked around, but I remember feeling uneasy before we even stepped through the broken side door. The inside reeked of mold and something sharper, maybe old chemicals soaked into the walls, paint peeled in long strips, hanging down like dead skin. Every step echoed way too loudly, as if the place was hollow, amplifying even the smallest sound. We wandered through hallways lined with rusted gurneys, graffiti covering the tiles. My friends mostly stuck together on the main floor, but I wanted better shots, so I drifted further, drawn to the stairwell that led down to the basement. The light there was weaker, my flashlight beam shaking across the walls as I went down. The basement was worse than I expected. Water pooled in corners, and the ceiling pipes dripped steadily, like a metronome ticking away the silence. That's where I found them. Dozens of patient files scattered across the damp concrete, their folders swollen with water damage. What made me stop wasn't just that they were left there, but that every single one had a red stamp across the cover. Deceased. I flipped through several, and something about them felt wrong. The patients had died in different years, but somehow all of them were listed as having died on the same exact day of the calendar. The deeper I dug into those files, the heavier the air felt. One folder belonged to a man in his 60s, another to a teenager, yet both had deceased stamped across the same day of the same month. I shuffled through at least a dozen before realizing they all matched. It didn't make sense. Different years, different circumstances, but the identical date repeated over and over. The hairs on my arms stood straight as I tried to convince myself it was some clerical error, maybe a lazy administrator reusing a stamp. Still, the thought of it lingered in my head like a riddle I wasn't supposed to solve. I remember hearing my friends laughing faintly upstairs, their voices bouncing through the pipes. But down there it sounded warped, almost muffled. The further I stood among those files, the more I felt like I shouldn't be down there at all. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw movement at the far end of the hallway. Just a shift of shadow, nothing I could define. My instinct told me to leave, but instead I crouched and stuffed one of the folders into my backpack. I wanted proof, something I could show them later so they'd believe me. When we left the hospital, the sun had already dipped low, turning the sky a dim orange. My friends were still joking, calling the trip a bust because nothing dramatic had happened. I didn't mention the files. It felt personal, like if I talked about it too soon, it would lose its weight or sound like I was making it up. We piled into my old sedan, and I tossed my camera bag onto the passenger seat, glancing back once at the hospital. For a moment, I swear I saw a light flicker in one of the basement windows, even though there hadn't been power there in decades. That night, after dropping everyone off, I parked outside my house and sat in the driveway, scrolling through the footage. The camera had captured everything: the graffiti, the dripping pipes, and finally those patient files. Watching it back made the whole thing feel worse, like the basement had swallowed sound differently than I remembered. I left the bag locked inside the car, figuring I'd edit the clips the next day. When I came out the following morning, the driver's side door was cracked open. My wallet was still there, my backpack untouched. The only thing missing was the camera. I tore the car apart, searching every corner, thinking maybe I'd misplaced it or left it with one of my friends. But the bag was right where I'd left it, only the camera was gone. No shattered glass, no sign of forced entry, almost like whoever took it knew exactly what they were looking for. My neighbors didn't report seeing anything, and none of the other cars on the street had been touched. Out of everything inside, only the camera had vanished. The weirdest part was that the folder I'd stuffed in my backpack was still there. I pulled it out, the paper warped and damp, the red deceased stamp bleeding faintly through the cover. Holding it made me uneasy in a way I can't explain, like the file wasn't supposed to exist outside that basement. I thought about bringing it to school, showing my friends, but something about the missing footage made me hesitate. If someone went out of their way to take the camera, maybe they didn't want that evidence seen again. A couple of days later, I worked up the courage to open the folder one last time. The details blurred together, hard to read through the water stains, but the death date was still clear. That's when I noticed something I'd missed. The signature at the bottom wasn't from a doctor or nurse, but from someone listed simply as attending. No name, no credentials, just that word repeated on every file. I shoved the folder back into my drawer, and to this day I haven't looked at it again. I never got the camera back. I reported the theft, but the police shrugged, said it was probably kids or someone looking to pawn electronics. But I know better. Someone broke into my car, skipped over cash and personal stuff, and took only the one thing holding proof of what I'd found. I can't prove it, but part of me is convinced that whatever secrets were buried in that hospital are meant to stay buried. The folder is still hidden in my closet, and sometimes late at night, I wonder if keeping it was the worst mistake I ever made. That night had started out in the usual small-town way, with everyone packed into the bleachers for the weekly high school football game. My girlfriend Emily and I weren't even that into football, but in our town, it was basically the only real entertainment on a Friday. I remember the sharp chill in the air when we left the field, the smell of concession stand popcorn still clinging to our jackets. We decided to take the long way home, the quieter county road that cut through farmland and patches of pine. It was late enough that traffic had thinned out, and the road felt like it belonged to us alone. I was behind the wheel of my old Chevy sedan, the heater humming against the cold. Emily sat next to me scrolling through her phone, the blue glow lighting up her face. We had the radio low, just background noise, some old country station that never came in clearly. The stretch we were on was dark. No streetlights, just the beams of our headlights carving a tunnel through the night. Every now and then we'd pass a mailbox leaning toward the ditch or a barn set way back from the road, but otherwise it was empty space and shadows. About halfway down that stretch, I noticed movement ahead. At first I thought it was a deer on the shoulder, so I slowed just a little. Then the figure stepped forward, illuminated in the glare of my headlights. It was a man standing by the ditch with one arm raised high, waving as if to flag us down. His clothes looked rough, layers of flannel and a dark jacket, and his posture was strange, too stiff, like he'd been waiting there. Emily leaned forward, squinting, and muttered, "Do you see that?" I eased off the gas, not stopping but letting the car slow enough to take a better look. The man didn't stumble or look injured, which struck me as odd. He was deliberate, standing like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. When our car drew closer, he suddenly broke into a sprint straight toward us, his arm no longer raised in distress. That's when I saw the metallic glint in his other hand, the unmistakable shape of a tire iron catching the light. Instinct took over and I slammed my foot back on the gas. The tires squealed against the pavement and the car lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of him swinging the tire iron downward, like he had actually tried to smash the windshield or grab onto the car. Emily let out this sharp gasp, clutching the side of her seat, and all I could hear for the next few seconds was the engine straining and her breathing quick. The road stretched out ahead of us like it would never end, and I didn't dare slow down. My pulse was hammering so hard it felt like it was inside my ears. For a few miles we said nothing, just sitting in the glow of the dashboard lights, trying to process what had almost just happened. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice tight, asking if I thought we should call the sheriff's office. At first, I wasn't even sure what I had seen. Had I overreacted? Maybe he wasn't running at us? But the memory of that metal in his hand, catching our headlights, left no doubt. This wasn't someone broken down on the side of the road. This was someone lying in wait. We pulled into the first gas station that still had its lights on and parked near the front door under the buzzing fluorescence. I got out, legs shaky, and walked inside to ask if I could use their landline since cell service in that area was spotty. The cashier, an older guy with a long gray beard and a name tag that read Dennis, listened as I explained what had happened. His expression hardened immediately, like this wasn't the first time he'd heard something like it. He nodded slowly and said he'd make the call for us, his voice low as if he didn't want anyone else in the store overhearing. While Dennis was on the phone with the sheriff's department, Emily came in and told me her brother had texted her that there were already rumors going around about someone dangerous along that same stretch of road. She said a couple of people she knew had mentioned seeing a guy waving cars down, claiming his truck had broken down. The difference was, in those stories, he'd supposedly gotten closer before anyone noticed the weapon. Hearing that made my skin prickle. This wasn't a one-time thing we'd stumbled into by bad luck. It felt more like we had brushed right up against something planned, rehearsed, and escalating. Not long after, a deputy pulled up outside the station and came in to talk to us. His uniform was wrinkled, like he'd been called in from home, but he carried himself with the kind of seriousness that told me he already knew the situation. He asked for every detail, what the man looked like, what he was wearing, which direction he'd come from. When I mentioned the tire iron, the deputy's jaw tightened, and he told us we weren't the only ones who had called that night. A few other drivers had nearly been ambushed along that same road, each describing the same man with the same weapon. The deputy walked us back out to my car and inspected the windshield and hood with his flashlight, almost like he expected to find dents. Seeing the light sweep over the chipped paint and the dust clinging to the bumper made me realize how close it had been. Emily stayed quiet, her arms folded tight, watching the deputy as though he might have answers we didn't. Before letting us go, he warned us to avoid that stretch of road for the time being. He didn't sugarcoat it. This guy's looking for victims, not help. When we finally got home, the adrenaline wore off, and the whole thing settled on me like a weight. I kept replaying it in my head, the way the man stood so still until we were close enough, then the sudden sprint, the flash of metal. It wasn't random. It was a trap, set in a place where most people wouldn't think twice about stopping to help someone. What scared me most wasn't just what almost happened to us, but the thought of who might not have been lucky enough to hit the gas in time. To this day, I don't know if the deputies ever caught the man. I never saw anything about it in the local paper, and nobody in town brought it up after a week or two. Life just moved on like it does in small towns. But for me, that stretch of road never looked the same again. Even now, when I pass by an empty shoulder at night, my foot hovers over the accelerator, and I catch myself scanning the darkness for movement, half expecting someone to step out of the ditch, waving me down with one hand and hiding something dangerous in the other.